The Andes Mountains rise from the earth like the spine of a continent, their peaks touching clouds, their slopes cradling civilizations that learn to thrive in the thin air where breathing itself becomes an act of will. Here, in these impossible altitudes, grows a plant that would change the world. A simple shrub with oval leaves, unremarkable to the untrained eye, yet containing within its cellular structure a molecule that would inspire reverence and addiction, medical breakthroughs and social catastrophe. Billion-dollar industries, both legal and criminal. This is the story of cocaine. Not the simplified narrative of good versus evil, not the morality tale of prohibition and addiction, but the complex, contradictory, deeply human story of how a sacred plant became a curse, how a miracle medicine became a scourge, how a molecule smaller than a grain of pollen could reshape economies, topple governments, destroy neighborhoods, and haunt the conscience of nations. Before we begin, what time is it where you're watching this from? I always wonder who's joining me at this hour of history. Tonight, as shadows lengthen and the world grows quiet, we will trace this substance through 5,000 years of human history. We will walk with Incan priests who burned coca leaves as offerings to the sun god. We will stand beside German chemists as they first isolated the crystalline alkaloid in gaslit laboratories. We will witness the birth of modern anesthesia in a Viennese hospital. We will watch cocaine flow like honey through the veins of Victorian society, a gentleman's drug served at fashionable parties, prescribed by the most respected physicians. We will follow its transformation into something darker, the racial panics and prohibition laws, the underground economy and criminal empires. We will see the rise of Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel, the crack epidemic that devastated American cities, the war on drugs that filled prisons without stopping the flow. And we will arrive, finally, at our present moment, where cocaine remains as available as ever despite a century of prohibition, where the violence continues in producing countries, where the debate between punishment and treatment still rages without resolution. This journey asks you to suspend judgment, to see with clear eyes, rather than through the distorting lens of propaganda from either side. Cocaine is neither wholly evil nor wholly benign. It is a tool, a medicine, a poison, a pleasure, depending on context and dose and intention. The story of cocaine is the story of humanity itself, our eternal quest to transcend our limitations, to ease our suffering, to experience pleasure, to make fortunes, to control others, to rebel against control. It is a mirror reflecting our brightest aspirations and darkest impulses, our scientific genius and our capacity for cruelty. So settle into this quiet hour. Let the world outside fade and prepare to see cocaine not as a simple problem with a simple solution, but as a thread woven through the tapestry of human civilization, impossible to remove without unraveling the whole cloth. The story begins not in a laboratory or a cartel compound, but in the thin air of the high Andes, where ancestors we can barely imagine discovered that chewing the leaves of a certain plant made the unbearable altitude bearable, the impossible labor possible. The sacred leaf, ancient origins in the Andes long before written history, before the rise of the Inca, before the Spanish ever dreamed of crossing the ocean. The peoples of the Andes had already discovered coca. The archaeological record speaks clearly across millennia. In northern Chile, mummies from the Alto Ramirez culture, their bodies preserved by the desert's perfect dryness, have been found with pouches of coca leaves and lime containers, tools for extracting the plant's alkaloids. Research using carbon-14 dating has confirmed coca leaf chewing among members of this population dating to 3,000 years before the present. The archaeological record speaks clearly across millennia of an enduring relationship between Andean peoples and this remarkable plant. The Valdivian culture, flourishing on the coast of Ecuador between approximately 3,500 and 1,500 BCE, left behind ceramic evidence of coca use. Pottery depicts figures with the characteristic bulge in the cheek, the wad of leaves held between gum and tooth. Lime containers called caleros appear in abundance at archaeological sites, their presence marking an unbroken tradition of coca consumption that stretches from that ancient period to the Spanish arrival and beyond. Archaeological evidence from various sites suggests coca use may extend back even further, with some findings of coca leaf fragments dated to 8,000 years ago. Though this remains a subject of ongoing research, the plant itself is botanically fascinating. Erythroxylum coca, the species most commonly cultivated, is a shrub that thrives at altitudes between 800 and 2,500 meters. It grows to perhaps 3 meters in height, with thin oval leaves that contain between 0.5 and 1% cocaine alkaloid, along with numerous other compounds. The plant requires careful cultivation and can produce up to 4 harvests per year under ideal conditions. The indigenous people of the Andes recognize different varieties, each with its own properties and uses. The Bolivian or Huánuco coca was considered the finest, widely traded throughout the region. But coca was far more than an agricultural product. It was woven into the spiritual and social fabric of Andean life. When the Inca Empire rose to dominance in the 15th century, coca achieved a sacred status unmatched by any other plant. The Inca believed that coca was a gift from the gods, specifically from Inti, the sun deity they worshipped above all others. Spanish chroniclers who observed Inca ceremonies recorded how priests would burn coca leaves, blowing the smoke toward the sun as an offering. The leaves were scattered at sacred sites throughout the empire. They were included in the elaborate offerings burned to honor the Sapa Inca, the divine emperor, upon his death. A legend preserved from Inca times tells of Cuca, a woman of extraordinary beauty who used her charms to manipulate men. When word of her misdeeds reached the ears of the Sapa Inca, he ordered her executed, cut in half, and buried. From her grave sprouted a miraculous plant that gave strength and vigor, alleviated pain and suffering. The people called it coca in honor of that beautiful and irresistible woman. Like many myths, this one contains deeper truths about how the Inca understood the plant's power, simultaneously dangerous and beneficial, demanding respect. The use of coca in Inca society was carefully controlled and stratified by class. In the early period of Inca dominance, coca consumption was largely restricted to the nobility and priesthood. To chew coca was a privilege of status, a marker of connection to the divine. The emperor maintained special gardens in Cusco, where coca plants were cultivated for ceremonial use. Representations of coca fashioned from precious metals adorned temples. Spanish chroniclers noted that wealthy Inca lords possessed elaborately decorated bags called chuspas for carrying coca leaves, along with spatulas for extracting the lime that activated the alkaloids. But as the Inca Empire expanded through conquest, as the need for labor to build roads and fortresses and terraces grew insatiable, coca began to serve a more practical purpose. The mita system, a form of labor tax required of all able-bodied men, demanded backbreaking work at altitude. Building the stone marvels of Machu Picchu and Sacsayhuaman required moving massive blocks up steep mountain slopes. Soldiers marching across the empire needed endurance beyond normal human capacity. Coca provided it. The Spanish chronicler Pedro Cieza de León, observing the conquered Inca in the decades after Pizarro's invasion, noted that the indigenous people always seemed to have coca in their mouths. Mita laborers, soldiers, and couriers called shaski, young men of athletic build who carried messages and goods across the empire on foot, all used coca extensively. By chewing the leaves mixed with a small amount of lime, which raised the pH and allowed the cocaine alkaloid to be absorbed through the mucous membranes, these workers could suppress hunger and thirst, ward off fatigue, and continue laboring for hours beyond what would otherwise be possible. Some historians believe that coca and chicha, a fermented corn beer, were the twin fuels that powered Inca imperial expansion. The Greek physician Pedanius Dioscorides described various medicinal plants in his work, but coca was unknown in the ancient Mediterranean. Research suggests that traditional users might chew 60 to 368 grams of leaves per day, according to various studies of Andean communities. Given that coca leaves typically contain between 0.1 and 0.9% cocaine alkaloid, this translates to approximately 200 to 300 milligrams of the alkaloid absorbed over 24 hours, enough for a mild stimulant effect but far below the doses that cause the euphoria and addiction associated with purified cocaine. The traditional method of consumption, with leaves held in the cheek rather than swallowed, with lime added to facilitate absorption, represents millennia of accumulated wisdom about how to safely access the plant's benefits. The cultural significance extended beyond labor and ceremony. Coca played a role in healing practices, with leaves applied to wounds, brewed into tea for stomach ailments, and used to treat altitude sickness. The practice of reading coca leaves, where leaves were dropped onto a cloth and their patterns interpreted to divine the future or answer questions, was widespread. This tradition, with variations, continues among Quechua and Aymara communities today. Coca was exchanged as gifts in social gatherings called holpay, where community members would come together, chew coca, and strengthen social bonds. The plant was as central to Andean culture as coffee or tea would later become to European and Asian societies. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, they encountered a civilization utterly foreign to their experience. Mountains that scraped the sky, cities built on principles they couldn't comprehend, and everywhere, people chewing green leaves, seemingly immune to the altitude that left the conquistadors gasping. The Spanish reaction to coca would be complex and contradictory, shaped by religious zeal, economic calculation, and grudging respect for the plant's practical utility. That reaction would set patterns that persist to this day. The tension between coca's traditional uses and its potential for abuse, between cultural respect and prohibition, between indigenous rights and international drug control. The story of cocaine is inextricable from the story of colonialism, of one civilization imposing its will and values on another. The Spanish would ban coca, then legalize it, then promote its cultivation even as they condemned its use in pagan ceremonies. They would observe its effects with fascination and horror, and eventually, they would carry samples back to Europe, where scientists would begin the work of understanding and isolating the active principles. That work would take centuries, but once it succeeded, once the alkaloid was separated from the leaf, once cocaine existed as a pure white powder, everything would change. The Spanish encounter, colonial discovery and exploitation. When Francisco Pizarro and his men arrived in Peru in 1532, they came seeking gold. What they found was an empire more vast and organized than anything in Europe, built on stone and sweat, and a system of governance that had united dozens of cultures under Inca rule. The conquest was swift and brutal. Atahualpa, the Inca emperor, was captured through treachery, held for ransom, and executed even after his people filled a room with gold. The Spanish were masters of European warfare, with horses and steel and guns and germs that decimated populations with no immunity. Within a few years, the Inca Empire had collapsed, and Spain claimed dominion over territories stretching from modern Colombia to Chile. The conquistadors were not scientists or anthropologists. They were soldiers and adventurers motivated by the promise of wealth. Their interest in local customs extended only as far as those customs affected their ability to extract value from the conquered lands. When they observed indigenous people chewing coca, their initial reaction was dismissive or hostile. Amerigo Vespucci, the Italian explorer whose name would be given to the continents, provided one of the first European descriptions of coca use in his memoirs. He noted that the people kept something in their mouths constantly, chewing without swallowing, a practice he found disgusting and incomprehensible. The Catholic Church, which accompanied the Spanish conquest as both moral authority and spiritual colonizer, condemned coca use as idolatry. The plant's role in Inca religious ceremonies made it suspect, possibly demonic, The devil, church authorities reasoned, had given the Indians this leaf to blind them to Christian truth. In 1551, the Church Council of Lima formally condemned coca, declaring it a pagan ritual that should be suppressed. Spanish priests launched campaigns to eliminate coca use, particularly in religious contexts. They were fighting not just a plant, but an entire cosmology, a way of understanding the relationship between humans and the divine that contradicted everything they believed. But economics has a way of overriding ideology. The Spanish quickly discovered that the silver mines of Potosi in modern Bolivia and the mercury mines of Huancavelica in Peru were the greatest sources of mineral wealth in the New World. These mines would fund the Spanish Empire for over a century, filling the coffers in Madrid and Seville, financing wars across Europe. But extracting silver and mercury from deep underground at high altitude required labor, vast amounts of labor, and the indigenous people who were forced into the mines through various coercive systems needed something to sustain them. The conditions in the mines were hellish beyond description. Men descended into darkness through narrow shafts, spending hours or days underground in tunnels that could collapse at any moment. The air was thin and foul. The work was brutally physical. Disease was rampant. The Spanish chronicler Juan de Matienzo wrote in 1567 that 6 out of 10 indigenous workers died of what they call the sickness of the Andes. The mines of Potosi and Huancavelica earned the grim title of the mines of death. Hundreds of thousands of indigenous people perished in these operations. Over the centuries of Spanish rule, coca, the Spanish discovered, made this exploitation more efficient. Workers chewing coca could labor longer hours, required less food, and seemed more resistant to the effects of altitude. The Spanish authorities, recognizing this utility, reversed their position. If coca helped extract silver, then coca should be promoted. The ban was lifted. Not only was coca legalized, but its cultivation was actively encouraged. Spanish landowners established coca plantations, dramatically increasing production. The plant that had once been reserved for Inca nobility and ceremonial use spread throughout the indigenous population. Spanish merchants grew wealthy from the coca trade. The Jesuit priest Bernabé Cobo, writing in the early 17th century, captured this transformation. It is the most profitable product in the Indies and has made many Spaniards rich. Another Spanish chronicler, Garcilaso de la Vega, recorded a conversation between two Spaniards near Cusco. One asked the other why he chewed coca like the Indians. When Spaniards found it disgusting, the reply was brutally honest. "In truth, sir, I detest it no less than anyone, but need force me to imitate the Indians and chew it. Without it, I would not be able to bear the burden." The speaker was carrying his 2-year-old daughter on his back, and even this Spaniard, a member of the conquering race, found he needed coca to survive at altitude. The Spanish attitude toward coca crystallized during the colonial period into a pattern that would persist. Official condemnation of indigenous use combined with practical exploitation of the plant's economic value. Priests continued to condemn coca in religious ceremonies, even as colonial administrators taxed its sale and used it to pay indigenous workers. The church and the crown existed in constant tension, one seeking spiritual conformity, the other demanding economic productivity. Despite centuries of contact, coca remained largely unknown in Europe itself. The leaves did not travel well. On the long sea voyage from South America to Spain, they degraded, losing potency. Samples sent back to Europe aroused little interest. The plant wouldn't grow in European climates. Without fresh leaves, Spanish physicians and naturalists couldn't properly study coca's effects. Descriptions in Spanish chronicles and medical texts noted that indigenous people used coca as a stimulant, that it suppressed hunger and fatigue, that they seemed to value it highly. But these were second-hand accounts, curiosities from a distant world. A few Spanish physicians experimented with coca. Nicolas Monades, a doctor in Seville who specialized in New World medicines, wrote about coca in his 1565 work, Historia medicinal de las cosas que se traen de nuestras Indias occidentales. He noted its stimulant properties and suggested it might have medical applications, but he lacked access to fresh leaves for systematic study. The Spanish medical establishment remained focused on traditional European medicines and the new drugs being discovered in Asia and the Pacific. Meanwhile, in the Andes, coca use had become ubiquitous among the indigenous population. The Spanish colonial system, for all its brutality, had inadvertently democratized access to coca. No longer restricted to elites, every indigenous worker could obtain leaves, either purchased or grown in small plots. Coca chewing became a marker of indigenous identity, a small act of cultural resistance in a world where almost everything else had been taken away. Spanish colonists and their mixed-race descendants generally avoided coca, associating it with indigenous culture and lower social status. This class division, where coca use marked one as Indian rather than European, would have long-lasting consequences. The Spanish colonial period established several patterns that would shape cocaine's later history. First, the association of coca with forced labor and exploitation. Second, the tension between prohibition on moral grounds and promotion for economic reasons. Third, the class and racial dynamics where coca use became associated with subjugated populations. Fourth, the recognition that coca had powerful effects that made it valuable, even if those effects weren't fully understood. These patterns would all resurface in different forms as cocaine moved from the Andes to Europe and North America. By the time Spain's empire in South America began to crumble in the early 19th century, coca cultivation had spread far beyond its original range. Plantations in Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, and Ecuador produced thousands of tons of leaves annually. The indigenous population remained dependent on coca for the same reasons they always had been. It made life at altitude tolerable, work in harsh conditions possible, but the plant's effects remained mysterious to science. No one knew why coca worked. No one had isolated or identified the active principle. Coca was still just leaves, chewed or brewed into tea, its power locked inside the plant's cellular structure. That was about to change. In Europe, a revolution was underway. Chemistry was emerging as a rigorous science, with new techniques for isolating and identifying compounds. Laboratories were being established at universities across Germany and France. Young scientists were learning to separate substances into their constituent parts, to purify and crystallize active principles. The tools now existed to unlock coca's secrets, and once those secrets were revealed, once the molecule called cocaine was isolated and studied and understood, the story would transform from local tradition to global phenomenon, from ancient practice to modern crisis. The scientific awakening, isolation, and early medical use. The story of cocaine's isolation is a story of patient chemistry conducted in 19th century laboratories, where glass vessels bubbled over gas flames and researchers carefully documented their findings. The transformation of coca from leaf to alkaloid required three crucial developments: reliable supplies of fresh leaves, advances in chemical extraction techniques, and scientists curious enough to investigate a plant that had received limited attention in European medicine. The first significant progress came in the 1850s. Friedrich Geitke, a German chemist, obtained a supply of relatively fresh coca leaves and attempted to extract their active principles. Using aqueous solutions and various solvents, he managed to produce white crystals contaminated with an oily residue. He named this substance erythroxylene, after the plant's botanical name, Erythroxylum coca. Geitke's extraction was crude by later standards, and his crystals were impure, but he had demonstrated that coca contained isolable alkaloids. His work was published in 1855, but attracted little attention. Around the same time, in 1859, Paolo Mantegazza, an Italian physician, returned from Peru, where he had witnessed coca used firsthand among the indigenous population. Unlike earlier European observers, Mantegazza was intrigued rather than dismissive. He experimented on himself, chewing coca leaves and recording his reactions with scientific precision. His published account described enhanced physical and mental performance, elevated mood, suppression of hunger, and a sense of well-being. Mantegazza's enthusiasm for coca would influence later researchers, including a young Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud. The breakthrough came in 1860 in the laboratory of Friedrich Wöhler at the University of Göttingen in Germany. Wöhler, already famous for synthesizing urea and thereby disproving the theory that organic compounds required a vital force, was one of the leading chemists in Europe. He had arranged for Karl Scherzer, a scientist aboard the Austrian frigate Novara on a round-the-world expedition, to bring him a large quantity of coca leaves from South America. When the ship returned in 1859, Wöhler received a trunk full of coca. Rather than study the leaves himself, he passed them to a graduate student named Albert Niemann, giving him the challenging task of isolating and characterizing the active ingredient. Niemann was methodical and talented. He developed an improved purification process using a mixture of 84% ethanol and 16% water, slightly acidified with dilute sulfuric acid. At a temperature of 40 degrees Celsius, he extracted the alkaloid and then carefully purified it through multiple crystallizations. His dissertation, titled Über eine neue organische Base in den Coca-Blättern, on a new organic base in the coca leaves, described every step. He obtained colorless, transparent prisms, pure cocaine hydrochloride. Niemann recorded his observations with clinical precision. Its solutions have an alkaline reaction, a bitter taste, promote the flow of saliva, and leave a peculiar numbness, followed by a sense of cold when applied to the tongue. This last observation, the numbness, would prove crucial. Niemann had discovered cocaine's anesthetic properties, though he didn't fully appreciate their importance. He named the substance cocaine, following the convention of adding the suffix "-ine" to alkaloid names. Tragically, Niemann died on January 19, 1861, at the age of 26, in his hometown of Goslar. Reports suggest his death resulted from suppuration of the lung, though the exact cause is not definitively established. His work with mustard gas, which he synthesized during experiments in 1860, may have contributed to his early death through toxic exposure. His colleague Wilhelm Lossen continued the work, correcting Niemann's molecular formula and establishing cocaine's correct chemical composition. C17H21NO4. By 1862, cocaine hydrochloride existed as a characterized chemical compound with known properties. The Merck Pharmaceutical Company in Darmstadt, Germany, began producing cocaine in 1862 using Niemann's purification technique. Initial production was small. Estimates suggest around 50 grams or less per year, because the process was difficult and supplies of coca leaves were unreliable. Nevertheless, Merck became the first company to consistently supply relatively pure cocaine to researchers and physicians, though availability remained quite limited for the next 2 decades. For the next 2 decades, cocaine remained largely a research curiosity. A few scientists experimented with it, noting its stimulant effects and the numbness it produced when applied to mucous membranes. In 1879, Vasily von Anrep at the University of Würzburg demonstrated cocaine's analgesic properties through a clever experiment. He prepared 2 jars, one containing a cocaine solution and one containing salt water. He submerged a frog's legs into the separate jars and then stimulated both legs in various ways. The leg in the cocaine solution reacted very differently, showing little response to stimuli that caused vigorous reactions in the control leg. Von Anrep concluded that cocaine had powerful anesthetic effects and suggested it might be valuable in surgery. But von Anrep's work didn't immediately revolutionize medicine. Cocaine was expensive, difficult to obtain, and most physicians were focused on other developments. The major surgical breakthrough of the era was general anesthesia, ether, and chloroform. which allowed complex operations without the patient feeling pain. Local anesthetics, which numbed only a specific area, seemed less important. Then came 1884, a year that would transform cocaine from laboratory curiosity to medical miracle to social plague within a span of months. The transformation began with two men in Vienna, Sigmund Freud and Karl Koller. Freud, a 28-year-old neurologist struggling to establish his career and support his fiancée Martha Bernays, was desperately seeking a breakthrough that would bring him fame and financial security. He read about cocaine in medical literature, particularly an article by Theodor Aschenbrandt, describing how cocaine had revived exhausted German soldiers. Freud was intrigued by cocaine's potential to treat various conditions, particularly morphine addiction, which was a growing problem in medical practice. In April 1884, Freud ordered his first gram of cocaine from Angel's Pharmacy in Vienna. He immediately began experimenting on himself, a common practice in medical research at the time. The effects were everything he had hoped for. He experienced what he called the most gorgeous excitement, an exhilaration and lasting euphoria that felt entirely natural and healthy. He found that cocaine improved his mood, increased his capacity for work, suppressed hunger, and seemed to have no negative effects. In letters to Martha, Freud was effusive. "Woe to you, my princess, when I come. I will kiss you quite red and feed you till you are plump. And if you are forward, you shall see who is stronger, a gentle little girl who doesn't eat enough, or a big wild man who has cocaine in his body." In July 1884, just 3 months after his first experience with cocaine, Freud published Über Coca in the Zentralblatt für die gesamte Therapie. The paper was comprehensive and enthusiastic, describing coca's history, cocaine's chemistry, and what Freud saw as its remarkable therapeutic potential. He recommended cocaine for depression, anxiety, digestive disorders, morphine addiction, alcoholism, and as a general stimulant. He claimed, based on his own experience, that cocaine was not addictive and produced no harmful after effects. Crucially, Freud's paper included a brief mention of cocaine's anesthetic properties. In what many historians consider almost a postscript, he noted that cocaine could numb mucous membranes and suggested this might have medical applications. But Freud was more interested in cocaine's psychological effects and rushed his paper into publication without fully exploring the anesthetic angle. This would prove to be Freud's great missed opportunity. Karl Koller, a young ophthalmologist and Freud's friend, read Über Coca with different eyes. Koller had been searching for a local anesthetic for eye surgery. At the time, eye operations were performed without anesthesia, with patients' heads held immobile, while surgeons worked on conscious, terrified individuals. Koller immediately recognized that cocaine's numbing effect could solve this problem. Koller experimented on himself and his colleagues, applying cocaine solution to their eyes and then pricking them with pins. The eyes felt nothing. On September 15, 1884, Koller presented his findings at the Ophthalmological Congress in Heidelberg. He couldn't afford to attend himself, so a friend, Joseph Brettauer, demonstrated the technique. The response was electric. Here, finally, was a local anesthetic that worked reliably and safely for eye surgery. Word spread with astonishing speed. Within weeks, physicians across Europe and America were using cocaine for eye operations. Within months, surgeons had extended its use to ear, nose, and throat procedures. By 1885, William Halsted in America demonstrated that cocaine could be injected near nerves to produce regional anesthesia, blocking sensation in entire limbs. The modern era of local anesthesia had begun, and it revolutionized surgery. Procedures that had been impossibly painful could now be performed with the patient conscious and comfortable. Freud received no credit for this breakthrough. Koller became famous as the discoverer of local anesthesia, while Freud's role was relegated to a footnote. This professional disappointment was compounded by personal tragedy. Freud had prescribed cocaine to his close friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow to treat his morphine addiction. The treatment was a disaster. Fleischl-Marxauer became addicted to both morphine and cocaine, suffered from paranoia and hallucinations, and died in agony at age 45 in 1891. Freud never publicly admitted his role in this catastrophe, but it must have haunted him. By the late 1880s, reports of cocaine addiction and cocaine psychosis were accumulating. The medical community began to recognize that Freud's optimistic claims about cocaine's safety were dangerously wrong. Freud quietly distanced himself from cocaine research and turned his attention to the work that would make him famous: psychoanalysis. His cocaine papers became an embarrassment he rarely discussed in later life. But the medical and social transformation had begun. Cocaine was no longer just an Andean leaf or a laboratory chemical. It was a pharmaceutical product, manufactured by companies like Merck and Parke-Davis, available to physicians and patients across the Western world. And once pharmaceutical companies recognized cocaine's commercial potential, once it became clear that this substance could be sold not just to doctors, but to the general public, the golden age of cocaine truly began. The Golden Age: patent medicines and Coca-Cola. The late 19th century was an extraordinary time for pharmaceutical innovation and commercial exploitation. It was an era before modern drug regulations, before controlled substances, before anyone had fully grasped the concept of addiction as we understand it today. In this environment, cocaine exploded from medical tool to mass-market product, appearing in wines, tonics, lozenges, and sodas sold to treat everything from headaches to melancholy. This was cocaine's golden age, when it was celebrated as a wonder drug, endorsed by popes and poets, and consumed by millions who had no idea they were developing habits that would prove nearly impossible to break. The pioneer of commercialized cocaine was Angelo Mariani, a French chemist from Corsica who created Vin Mariani in 1863. Mariani's innovation was simple but brilliant. He combined coca leaf extract with Bordeaux wine. The alcohol extracted the cocaine from the leaves and provided a pleasant vehicle for consumption. Each ounce of Vin Mariani contained about 6 milligrams of cocaine, along with 17% alcohol. The combination produced effects beyond those of either substance alone. The cocaine counteracted alcohol's sedative properties, while the alcohol enhanced cocaine's euphoric effects. Mariani marketed his wine as a treatment for just about every ailment imaginable: fatigue, depression, digestive problems, anemia, nervous disorders. His advertising was sophisticated for its time, featuring testimonials from satisfied users. And what users they were! Vin Mariani was consumed by heads of state, literary figures, and cultural icons. Pope Leo XIII became such a devoted user that he awarded Mariani a Vatican gold medal and was said to carry a flask of the wine with him always. Thomas Edison drank it. Ulysses S. Grant consumed it while dying of throat cancer. Sarah Bernhardt, the famous actress, endorsed it. Jules Verne, author of science fiction classics, was a fan. Queen Victoria of England reportedly used it. Mariani became fabulously wealthy, quite possibly the world's first cocaine millionaire. His success spawned countless imitators throughout Europe and America, each producing their own coca wine combinations with varying cocaine content and wild therapeutic claims. The market was entirely unregulated. Anyone could create a medicine, claim it cured diseases, and sell it to a public that had little way of knowing what they were actually consuming. In America, the patent medicine industry seized on cocaine with particular enthusiasm. John Pemberton, a pharmacist in Atlanta, Georgia, created his own coca wine called Pemberton's French Coca Wine. He promoted it as a cure for morphine addiction, nervousness, headaches, and neuralgia. His version contained more cocaine than Mariani's, a more is better approach to marketing. Pemberton did a brisk business until 1885, when the Ku Klux Klan's pressure led to alcohol prohibition in Atlanta. Suddenly, Pemberton's wine-based medicine was illegal. Pemberton responded by reformulating. He replaced the wine with carbonated water, added sugar and various flavoring agents including extracts from the African cola nut, which contains caffeine, and created a new product. He called it Coca-Cola. The drink was marketed as a patent medicine, a brain tonic, and intellectual beverage that would cure headaches and relieve exhaustion. The original formula contained cocaine from coca leaf extract and caffeine from cola nut, a combination of stimulants that provided a reliable kick. Coca-Cola debuted in 1886 at Jacobs' pharmacy in Atlanta, where it was sold at the soda fountain for 5 cents a glass. Pemberton marketed it aggressively with claims that it would cure tired feeling and mental and physical exhaustion. The cocaine content was likely around 9 milligrams per glass. Based on later analyses of similar coca leaf extracts, this was enough for a noticeable stimulant effect, though much less than the amounts users would later consume when snorting pure cocaine. Pemberton sold his interest in Coca-Cola in 1888, dying soon after from stomach cancer. The drink was acquired by Asa Griggs Candler, who recognized its commercial potential and ramped up production and marketing. By the early 1900s, Coca-Cola was being sold across the United States. The coca leaf extract remained part of the formula initially, though the company gradually reduced and then removed the cocaine content. By around 1903, Coca-Cola had switched to using spent coca leaves, leaves from which cocaine had already been extracted, leaving only trace amounts or no cocaine at all. The company continued using decocainized coca leaf extract for flavoring, a practice that continues in modified form today. Cocaine appeared in countless other products during this golden age. Allen's cocaine tablets were marketed to actors, singers, and public speakers to clear the voice. They were also touted as a treatment for hay fever, asthma, and sore throats. Rhino's hay fever and catarrh. Remedy, a nasal spray, contained cocaine. Cocaine toothache drops were sold for children, promising instant pain relief. Lloyd's cocaine toothache drops featured an illustration of a smiling child with text assuring parents that the product was instantaneous in its effects. The pharmaceutical companies Merck and Parke-Davis produced pure cocaine in increasingly large quantities. Parke-Davis's catalog described cocaine as a wonderful drug and one of the most important therapeutic discoveries of the age. They sold cocaine in various forms: crystals, powder, solution, even cigarettes and inhalers. By the 1890s, cocaine could be purchased over the counter at any pharmacy, ordered from mail-order catalogs, or obtained from traveling salesmen. It was cheaper than alcohol in many places, and far more socially acceptable. A gentleman could use cocaine openly without the stigma attached to drunkenness. This widespread availability had predictable consequences. While many users consumed cocaine in the small doses found in tonics and wines without obvious problems, others quickly discovered that larger doses produced more intense euphoria. The practice of snorting cocaine powder began around 1905, allowing much larger doses to enter the bloodstream quickly through the nasal mucosa. Injection, either subcutaneous or intravenous, provided even more intense effects. Users who started with Vin Mariani or Coca-Cola might progress to pure powder and then to injection. The medical community began to observe disturbing patterns. Patients who started taking cocaine for legitimate medical reasons, for local anesthesia during dental work for example, would sometimes request more and more. Physicians' offices were burglarized by people seeking cocaine supplies. People who had been prescribed cocaine for depression would become emotionally volatile, swinging between euphoria and despair. Strange behaviors emerged. Cocaine users reported feeling insects crawling under their skin, a condition that came to be called cocaine bugs or formication. They would scratch themselves bloody trying to dig out imaginary parasites. By the early 1900s, the first medical papers describing cocaine addiction appeared. Louis Lewin, a German pharmacologist, published detailed case studies of chronic cocaine users. They described paranoia, hallucinations, weight loss, insomnia, and a compulsive pattern of use that resembled nothing so much as the morphine addiction that cocaine had supposedly cured. The pattern was always the same: initial euphoria and increased energy, followed by a need for higher doses to achieve the same effects, followed by inability to function without the drug, followed by physical and mental deterioration. Yet the patent medicine industry continued to thrive. The testimonials kept coming. The advertisements grew more elaborate. Manufacturers insisted their products were harmless, that problems arose only from misuse or impure cocaine. The economic incentives were simply too powerful. Vin Mariani alone was selling millions of bottles per year by the turn of the century. Coca-Cola was becoming one of America's most recognized brands. Park Davis's cocaine sales were a significant portion of the company's revenue. The social dynamics of cocaine use during this golden age were complex and would have profound implications for what came later. Initially, cocaine was associated with the upper and middle classes. It was a gentleman's drug used by professionals, artists, and intellectuals. The imagery in advertisements showed well-dressed people in comfortable settings. The price point, while affordable, was still beyond what the poorest workers could regularly afford. Cocaine was respectable, even fashionable. But as production increased and prices dropped, cocaine use spread across class lines. Factory workers used it to maintain energy during long shifts. Stevedores at ports used it for physically demanding labor. In urban areas, cocaine became available in less respectable establishments, brothels, gambling dens, and what were then called dope joints. The association between cocaine and vice districts began to form, particularly in cities like New York, Chicago, and New Orleans. The racial dynamics were even more troubling and would prove devastatingly consequential. In the American South, there were lurid and almost certainly exaggerated reports of black laborers using cocaine, with white authorities claiming it made them aggressive and dangerous. These reports, appearing in newspapers and medical journals, fed into existing racial prejudices and would eventually become a major justification for cocaine prohibition. The racial panic around cocaine-crazed Negroes was largely fabricated, but it was politically powerful. The Golden Age also saw cocaine spread beyond Europe and North America. British colonial administrators brought cocaine to India and East Africa. Japanese pharmaceutical companies began producing it. By 1910, cocaine was a global commodity, manufactured on 4 continents, consumed by millions of people who still largely believed they were using a beneficial medicine. Literature and popular culture of the era reflected cocaine's ubiquity. Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes famously used a 7% solution of cocaine, injecting it when he lacked the mental stimulation of a challenging case. The stories presented this as a character flaw, but not an immediately dangerous one. Robert Louis Stevenson reportedly wrote The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde while using cocaine, and some scholars have suggested the novella is an allegory for cocaine's transformative effects. Cocaine appeared in poems, plays, and popular songs, usually portrayed as sophisticated or daring, rather than dangerous. Medical use reached its peak around 1905. Cocaine had become the standard local anesthetic for many surgical procedures. Dentists used it routinely. Ophthalmologists relied on it. Ear, nose, and throat specialists considered it indispensable. The amounts used medically were generally moderate and controlled, and in these contexts, cocaine genuinely was a miracle drug that made previously impossible or agonizing procedures routine and painless. But recreational use was spiraling out of control. Emergency rooms were seeing cocaine overdoses. Sanatoriums were treating cocaine addiction alongside morphine and alcohol addiction. Coroners were recording cocaine-related deaths. The dark side of the wonder drug was becoming impossible to ignore. The response from the medical profession was gradual and conflicted. Some physicians called for stricter controls on cocaine distribution. Others insisted that cocaine itself was safe when properly prescribed. and that problems arose only from impure street cocaine or excessive doses. Pharmaceutical companies defended their products vigorously, funding studies that minimized risks and emphasized benefits. The American Medical Association, founded in 1847 to improve medical standards, began discussing cocaine regulation, but moved slowly, torn between respecting physicians' prescribing freedom and protecting public health. The turning point came from an unexpected source: international diplomacy and domestic racial politics. The United States, newly positioned as a colonial power after the Spanish-American War, sought to assert moral leadership in international affairs. Opium addiction in the Philippines, now an American territory, became a cause for concern. The US government began pushing for international drug control, hosting conferences on opium regulation. But to have moral authority on opium, America needed to regulate drugs domestically, including cocaine. This is where the golden age began to tarnish. The combination of genuine medical concerns about addiction, economic interests threatened by patent medicine competition, progressive-era reformers seeking to regulate commerce and protect consumers, and racial anxieties about cocaine use by minority populations created a perfect storm. The tide was turning against unrestricted cocaine, but the process would be gradual, contested, and would ultimately fail to stop cocaine use while creating an enormous black market and devastating social consequences. As we move from the golden age to the era of prohibition, remember that the people living through this transformation had no crystal ball. They couldn't know that prohibition would spawn organized crime networks, that it would disproportionately impact poor and minority communities, that it would fail to stop cocaine use while making it far more dangerous. They were responding to real problems: addiction, overdoses, social disruption, with what seemed like logical solutions: regulation, restriction, prohibition. The path to our current situation was paved with good intentions, bad science, cynical politics, and unintended consequences. Medicine becomes recreation. The social transformation. The transition from cocaine as medicine to cocaine as vice was neither sudden nor inevitable. It happened gradually, unevenly, across different social contexts and geographic locations. Understanding this transformation requires looking beyond simple narratives of discovery and prohibition to examine how different communities understood and used cocaine, how patterns of use evolved, and how the drug's meaning shifted from therapeutic to recreational to criminal. In the first decade of the 20th century, cocaine existed simultaneously in multiple social worlds. In hospitals and dental offices, it remained a valuable anesthetic, used by respectable physicians to ease suffering. In bourgeois homes, it was present in patent medicines stored in bathroom cabinets, occasionally consumed for headaches or fatigue. In urban entertainment districts, it was becoming a party drug, used by those seeking excitement and intensity. In working-class neighborhoods, it was sometimes used to sustain energy through exhausting labor. Each context created different understandings of what cocaine was and what it meant to use it. The emergence of recreational cocaine use is documented in medical literature from the period, though we must read these sources carefully, aware of their biases and limitations. Dr. George E. Petty, writing in the Memphis Medical Monthly in 1903, described patients who had begun using cocaine for medical reasons, typically as a local anesthetic, and then continued using it for the pleasurable effects. He noted a progression that would become familiar. Initial use produced intense euphoria and increased confidence, leading users to seek those feelings again. Tolerance developed quickly, requiring higher doses. When cocaine wore off, users experienced depression and lethargy that made sobriety feel unbearable. Urban areas saw the emergence of what contemporaries called cocaine dens, or coke parlors, spaces where cocaine could be purchased and consumed. These establishments existed in a legal grey area. Cocaine itself was not yet illegal, but these spaces often operated alongside other activities that were prostitution, gambling, after-hours alcohol sales during local prohibition periods. Police raids of such establishments were reported in newspapers, usually focused on the other illegal activities but mentioning cocaine use as evidence of moral degradation. The theatrical world embraced cocaine enthusiastically, or at least parts of it did. Performers valued cocaine's ability to provide energy for long performances, to calm stage fright while maintaining alertness, to create a sense of confidence and charisma. Backstage cocaine use was common enough that it prompted worried editorials in theater trade publications. Some performers developed serious habits that affected their careers and health. The association between cocaine and show business would persist throughout the 20th century. Medical professionals themselves were not immune. Physicians, dentists, and pharmacists had easy access to pure cocaine and detailed knowledge of its effects. Some experimented with it, initially for professional curiosity, but sometimes progressing to dependence. William Halsted, the pioneering surgeon who demonstrated cocaine's use in regional anesthesia, was himself a cocaine addict for much of his career. His colleagues helped him overcome the addiction through substitution with morphine, creating a dual addiction that he managed while continuing his groundbreaking surgical work. Halsted's case illustrates how addiction could coexist with high-level professional function, at least for a time. The class dynamics of cocaine use shifted during this period in ways that would prove crucial for subsequent prohibition efforts. Initially associated with upper and middle classes, cocaine use spread downward economically as prices fell and availability increased. Patent medicines containing cocaine were affordable to working-class consumers. In urban areas, cocaine powder could be purchased in small quantities at prices competitive with alcohol. This democratization of access alarmed social reformers and medical authorities who associated drug use by the poor with crime and social disorder. Women's cocaine use became a particular focus of concern and sensationalism. Medical literature from the period contains numerous case studies of women who became addicted to cocaine, often through patent medicines prescribed for female complaints or nervous disorders. The progressive era's complicated attitudes toward women, simultaneously championing their rights while insisting they needed protection, shaped responses to female cocaine users. They were portrayed as victims of unscrupulous drug dealers or weak-willed individuals who had fallen into vice, narratives that denied women's agency while stigmatizing them. The South became a flashpoint for cocaine panic, particularly around racial dynamics. Southern newspapers published lurid accounts of black men using cocaine and committing crimes or acting aggressively toward whites. These accounts were almost certainly exaggerated or fabricated, serving to justify existing racial hierarchies and Jim Crow laws. Dr. Edward Huntington Williams wrote in the New York Times in 1914 that cocaine was fueling Negro rapes of white women, and that cocaine made black men resistant to bullets, requiring police to use more powerful ammunition. These claims were racist propaganda, but they were widely believed and became a major justification for cocaine prohibition. The actual patterns of cocaine use among black Americans were likely similar to those among whites, with use concentrated in urban areas and among those with disposable income. But the narrative of the cocaine-crazed Negro was politically useful, providing a socially acceptable rationale for prohibition that appealed to racial anxieties. This racial dimension would haunt drug policy throughout the 20th century, with prohibition laws consistently applied more harshly to minority communities. International dimensions also shaped cocaine's transformation. German pharmaceutical companies, particularly Merck, had dominated cocaine production, but by 1910, production facilities existed worldwide. The Netherlands became a major producer. Japanese pharmaceutical companies entered the market. Coca leaf cultivation expanded in Java, Indonesia, where the Dutch colonial government promoted it as a cash crop. This global production network meant that even as concerns about cocaine grew, the economic infrastructure for continued supply was firmly established. The medical profession's response to growing addiction problems was complicated by financial interests and professional pride. Physicians had championed cocaine as a wonder drug. Admitting it was dangerous required acknowledging errors in judgment. Pharmaceutical companies funded research minimizing cocaine's risks and emphasizing user culpability rather than the drug's inherent dangers. Medical journals published conflicting assessments, with some calling for strict controls while others insisted cocaine was safe when properly prescribed. By 1910, the pattern was clear. Cocaine had become a major social problem, but the response was fragmented and ineffective. Some states had enacted laws restricting cocaine sales, but enforcement was minimal and interstate commerce remained unregulated. Federal action was complicated by constitutional questions about whether Congress had authority to regulate drugs, which were traditionally matters of state law. The solution would come through creative use of federal taxing power, but it would take years to implement and would create as many problems as it solved. The recreational use of cocaine continued to evolve during this transitional period. Snorting cocaine powder, which became common around 1905, allowed much higher doses than were present in patent medicines. Users discovered that snorting produced effects within minutes: intense euphoria, heightened confidence, increased energy. But these effects lasted only 30 to 60 minutes, followed by a crash that made users crave more. This pattern of compulsive redosing was far more problematic than the sustained mild stimulation from coca wines or tonics. Injection, both subcutaneous and intravenous, represented the most dangerous development. Injection delivered cocaine directly into the bloodstream, producing almost instantaneous effects of overwhelming intensity. But it also carried risks of overdose, infection, and rapid addiction. Medical literature from the 1910s contains horrifying descriptions of chronic injectors, their bodies covered with injection sites, their mental state deteriorating into paranoia and psychosis. Injection also increased overdose risk, as the difference between a euphoric dose and a fatal dose could be small. The language used to describe cocaine users evolved in ways that reveal changing attitudes. In the 1880s and 1890s, people took cocaine or used it, neutral terminology suggesting agency and choice. By the 1910s, they were victims of the cocaine habit, language implying loss of control and moral weakness. By the 1920s, they were dope fiends, explicitly criminal and threatening. This linguistic shift both reflected and reinforced cocaine's transformation from medicine to menace. Popular culture also shifted. The sophisticated image of Sherlock Holmes injecting cocaine for intellectual stimulation gave way to sensationalist stories of cocaine-driven crime and degradation. Newspaper exposes detailed the supposed horrors of cocaine use, with lurid headlines and exaggerated accounts designed to shock readers and sell papers. The yellow journalism of the era treated cocaine as a source of titillating stories rather than a complex social problem requiring nuanced analysis. Reformers of the progressive era, who championed regulations on food safety, working conditions, and child labor, increasingly focused on drugs, including cocaine. These reformers saw drug addiction as both a public health crisis and a moral failing requiring government intervention. Their coalition included physicians concerned about addiction, religious leaders opposed to intoxication in any form, women's groups focused on protecting families, and businesses that saw regulated pharmaceuticals as more profitable than unregulated patent medicines. This diverse coalition would successfully push for cocaine prohibition, though not without controversy and opposition. As we approach the legislative response to cocaine, it's worth reflecting on what had been lost. Cocaine genuinely was a valuable anesthetic, and restrictions would complicate medical use. Many people had used coca products for years without obvious problems. The coca leaf, as used traditionally in the Andes, was still a beneficial plant that helped people cope with altitude and labor. But nuance was disappearing from the debate. Cocaine was becoming simply bad, a threat to be eliminated, rather than a substance requiring careful regulation and education. The stage was set for prohibition. The question was not whether cocaine would be restricted, but how severely and with what consequences. The answer would shape not just cocaine policy, but drug policy generally for the next century, creating patterns of enforcement, criminalization, and social control that persist to this day. The path from medicine to menace was complete. Now came the attempt to put the genie back in the bottle, an attempt that would fail spectacularly while causing immense collateral damage. The First War on Cocaine, Prohibition and its consequences. The early 20th century saw a dramatic transformation in how governments approached psychoactive substances. What had been largely unregulated commerce became the subject of criminal law. This shift happened through a combination of genuine public health concerns, economic interests, moral reform movements, racial anxieties, and international diplomacy. The resulting laws would criminalize millions of people over the following century, while failing to significantly reduce drug availability. Understanding this pivot point is essential to understanding where we are today. The international dimension began with opium, not cocaine. The United States, having acquired the Philippines from Spain in 1898, faced a significant opium addiction problem among the Filipino population. Charles Henry Brent, the Episcopal Bishop of the Philippines, championed opium control as both a public health and moral issue. He convinced President Theodore Roosevelt to host an international opium commission in Shanghai in 1909. 13 nations attended, though the Commission's recommendations were non-binding. A second conference met in The Hague in 1911-1912, producing the International Opium Convention, which required signatories to control opium, morphine, cocaine, and other drugs. The convention created international legal obligations but left implementation to individual nations. For the United States, this created both an opportunity and a problem. Congress would need to pass domestic legislation to fulfill international treaty obligations, overcoming constitutional concerns about federal authority over medicine and commerce. The legislative solution was the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, named for Representative Francis Burton Harrison of New York. The act used Congress's constitutional authority to levy taxes as a mechanism for drug control. It required anyone producing, importing, manufacturing, selling, or distributing narcotics, defined to include cocaine, despite cocaine not being a narcotic, to register with the Treasury Department and pay occupational taxes. Transactions had to be recorded, and drugs could only be transferred using official order forms. Crucially, the act included a provision allowing doctors to prescribe narcotics in the course of professional practice. This seemingly straightforward language would become a battleground. Did professional practice include prescribing maintenance doses to addicts, or only treating addiction through abstinence? The medical community was divided, and so were federal authorities. The Supreme Court would eventually rule in United States v. Doremus, 1919, and Webb v. United States, 1919, that maintenance prescribing was not legitimate medical practice, effectively criminalizing the medical treatment of addiction through prescription. The Harrison Act passed with relatively little controversy, partly because its full implications weren't immediately obvious. It appeared to be a regulatory measure, not prohibition. Cocaine could still be prescribed by physicians and dispensed by pharmacists. But enforcement, handled by the Treasury Department's Bureau of Internal Revenue, predecessor to the IRS, quickly became punitive. Revenue agents raided pharmacies, arrested physicians who prescribed maintenance doses to addicts, and created a climate of fear in the medical community. Many doctors stopped treating addicts entirely rather than risk prosecution. The enforcement strategy revealed the Act's true purpose: not regulation, but prohibition disguised as taxation. Between 1915 and 1938, Over 25,000 physicians were arrested under the Harrison Act. About 3,000 were convicted and sent to prison. The medical profession largely retreated from treating addiction, viewing addicts as criminals rather than patients. This withdrawal of medical support left addicts with no legal sources of drugs, forcing them into illegal markets that were already developing. The racial dimension of enforcement was evident from the beginning. While users were found across all racial and economic groups, arrests and prosecutions disproportionately targeted Black, Latino, and Chinese Americans. The narrative of cocaine-crazed black men attacking whites, promoted by figures like Hamilton Wright, the father of American narcotics laws, provided justification for aggressive enforcement in black communities. Police in southern states used cocaine possession as a pretext for harassment and arrest, tools for maintaining racial hierarchy through selective law enforcement. The impact on cocaine availability and use patterns was complex. Patent medicines containing cocaine were effectively banned, and legitimate medical use declined sharply as physicians avoided prescribing it except for local anesthesia. But recreational cocaine use didn't disappear. It went underground. Illegal markets emerged to supply users who couldn't or wouldn't stop. Prices increased, quality became inconsistent, and the risks of use multiplied as users had no way to know what they were actually consuming. The 1920s brought additional complications. Alcohol prohibition, implemented through the 18th Amendment in 1920, created vast illegal distribution networks and normalized law-breaking among otherwise law-abiding citizens. These same networks often handled cocaine and other drugs. Speakeasies might sell cocaine alongside illegal alcohol. The criminal organizations that built wealth from bootlegging expanded into drug trafficking. Prohibition, intended to improve public health and morality, instead criminalized significant portions of the population and enriched organized crime. Cocaine use during the 1920s moved further into underground spaces and marginalized communities. Jazz clubs and Harlem speakeasies became associated with cocaine use, reinforcing racial stereotypes and providing law enforcement with targets. The connection between cocaine and black culture, always more perception than reality, became more firmly established in the white imagination, with devastating consequences for enforcement patterns and public policy. Medical research on cocaine addiction continued but faced obstacles. The most interesting work happened at institutions willing to study addiction scientifically rather than morally. The Philadelphia General Hospital established one of the first addiction treatment clinics, attempting maintenance, prescribing, and behavioral interventions. Dr. Lawrence Kolb at the U.S. Public Health Service conducted research suggesting that many drug users were self-medicating, underlying psychological problems, arguing for medical rather than criminal approaches. But these voices were marginalized in a policy environment dominated by prohibitionist ideology. International cocaine production patterns shifted in response to prohibition. Pharmaceutical production continued in countries with less restrictive laws. The Netherlands, Germany, and Japan maintained significant cocaine manufacturing capacity, ostensibly for medical exports, but with drugs often diverted to illegal markets. Peru and Bolivia continued cultivating coca, with some production still going to legitimate pharmaceutical use, but increasing amounts entering illegal channels. The global cocaine trade was adapting to prohibition, becoming more sophisticated and harder to control. The Bureau of Prohibition, established in 1920 under the Treasury Department, became the primary enforcement agency for both alcohol and drug laws. Later reorganized as the Bureau of Narcotics in 1930 under Harry Anslinger, it would dominate American drug policy for decades. Anslinger, a shrewd political operator who led the Bureau until 1962, championed punitive approaches to drug enforcement and successfully fought attempts to treat addiction medically. His influence extended internationally through his role in United Nations drug control efforts. By the 1930s, the pattern was set. Cocaine was illegal outside narrow medical uses, Enforcement was selective and often racist. Medical treatment of addiction was effectively criminalized. Illegal markets had emerged to meet continued demand, and the policy framework treated drug use as primarily a criminal justice rather than public health issue. These patterns would persist, with modifications, through the rest of the 20th century. The consequences of this first war on cocaine extended far beyond the drug itself. The legal and enforcement frameworks developed for cocaine and opiates created templates that would be applied to marijuana in the 1930s, LSD and psychedelics in the 1960s, and methamphetamine later. The precedent of using criminal law to control consciousness-altering substances, despite limited effectiveness and significant collateral damage, became deeply embedded in American policy. The international drug control regime, built on American advocacy, spread these approaches globally. For cocaine itself, prohibition created a period of reduced visibility rather than reduced use. Cocaine went underground, continuing to circulate in artistic and bohemian circles, in urban vice districts, among those wealthy enough to afford black market prices. The medical literature of the period contains fewer studies of cocaine addiction, not because it disappeared, but because it became harder to study legally, and because researchers faced professional risks from association with the topic. Cocaine entered what we might call a quiet period, overshadowed by alcohol prohibition in the 1920s and depression economics in the 1930s. But it never went away. And when social conditions changed again in the post-World War II era, cocaine would return, carried on new networks connecting Colombian cultivation to American markets, initiating the modern cocaine trade that continues today. The quiet decades. Cocaine underground between the 1930s and the late 1960s. Cocaine existed in a kind of cultural shadow, neither fully forgotten nor prominently visible. This period, which we might call the quiet decades, saw cocaine use continue at reduced levels, concentrated in specific subcultures and communities largely invisible to mainstream society. Understanding these decades is important because they demonstrate that prohibition doesn't eliminate drug use. It drives it underground, making it less visible, but not less real, and creating the conditions for explosive resurgence when circumstances change. The Great Depression of the 1930s significantly impacted cocaine use patterns. Economic collapse made most drugs unaffordable luxuries for the majority of Americans. The illegal cocaine that circulated commanded high prices that few could pay. Additionally, the social disruption of the Depression focused public attention on economic survival rather than drug control. Newspapers carried fewer sensational stories about cocaine. Law enforcement agencies faced budget cuts. Drug use, including cocaine use, declined not primarily due to successful prohibition, but due to poverty. World War II further disrupted drug markets. German pharmaceutical companies that had produced much of the world's legitimate and semi-legitimate cocaine were cut off from international markets. Shipping routes were disrupted by submarine warfare and military priorities. South American coca production continued, but getting product to North American and European markets became difficult. The war also created a cultural environment that de-emphasized personal pleasure in favor of collective sacrifice. Drug use was portrayed as unpatriotic, undermining the war effort. Young men who might have been cocaine users were in military service, subject to military discipline and frequent relocation that disrupted established patterns. But cocaine didn't disappear. It continued to circulate in specific communities where it had established footholds. The jazz world maintained its relationship with cocaine through the 1940s and 1950s. Musicians valued cocaine's ability to provide energy for late-night performances, to enhance creativity and improvisational ability, to maintain the intense focus required for virtuoso playing. The legendary saxophonist Charlie Parker was known to use cocaine along with heroin, a combination called a speedball. Billie Holiday, whose haunting voice defined an era, struggled with heroin and cocaine addiction throughout her career. These weren't casual users, but individuals whose lives and art were deeply entangled with drugs. The Beat generation of the 1950s, cultural rebels who rejected mainstream American conformity, experimented with various drugs including cocaine. While they're more associated with marijuana, benzodrine, and later heroin, cocaine circulated in beat circles in New York and San Francisco. The writer William S. Burroughs, whose work often dealt with drug addiction and altered states, used cocaine periodically. The cultural value the Beats placed on authentic experience and consciousness expansion created a context where drug use, including cocaine use, was seen as potentially meaningful rather than simply deviant. Medical use of cocaine continued in limited contexts throughout these decades. Ophthalmologists still used it for certain eye procedures, though synthetic alternatives like procaine, developed in 1905, increasingly replaced cocaine. Ear, nose, and throat specialists used cocaine solutions for procedures in those areas where its unique combination of anesthesia and vasoconstriction was valuable. Pharmaceutical companies continued producing small quantities for these medical uses, strictly regulated and monitored, but still legally manufactured. In the Andes, traditional coca use continued largely unchanged. The prohibition regimes of North America and Europe had limited impact on communities that had used coca for thousands of years. Peruvian and Bolivian peasants still chewed coca leaves during agricultural labor, still used it in spiritual ceremonies, still valued it as a culturally important plant. International drug control efforts sometimes attempted to extend prohibition to coca leaf, but these efforts faced resistance from Andean governments who recognized the cultural importance and lack of harm from traditional use. This tension between international drug control and indigenous rights would persist throughout the 20th century. The pharmaceutical industry's relationship with cocaine became more complex. While legal production continued for medical uses, companies had to navigate increasingly strict regulations and monitoring. The potential liability from cocaine products, combined with the availability of synthetic alternatives, meant that most companies were happy to phase out cocaine production. Merck, which had been the first major cocaine manufacturer, gradually reduced production. Parke-Davis, which had once promoted cocaine enthusiastically, largely exited the cocaine business. By the 1960s, very few pharmaceutical companies were producing cocaine, and those that did made it in small quantities for narrow medical applications. The illegal market during these decades was relatively small and localized. Cocaine was expensive and difficult to obtain. Most illicit cocaine came from diversion of pharmaceutical supplies or small-scale smuggling from South America. There were no large criminal organizations dedicated primarily to cocaine trafficking, as would emerge later. Heroin dominated the illegal drug market in terms of both volume and law enforcement attention. Cocaine was a minor problem by comparison. This period also saw the development of the modern drug treatment infrastructure. Alcoholics Anonymous, founded in 1935, pioneered the 12-step approach to addiction treatment. While initially focused on alcohol, the model would be adapted to other substances. The Public Health Service operated addiction treatment facilities, including the one at Lexington, Kentucky, which admitted both voluntary patients and incarcerated addicts. These facilities treated primarily heroin addiction, but saw occasional cocaine cases. The treatment philosophy was abstinence-based, viewing any drug use as relapse and requiring complete cessation. Academic research on cocaine was limited during these decades. The stigma attached to drug research, the difficulty of obtaining research approval for controlled substances, and the relative lack of visibility of cocaine addiction meant that few scientists studied it. Most research on addiction focused on alcohol or heroin. The neuroscience of addiction was primitive by modern standards. Dopamine wouldn't be identified until 1957, and its role in reward and addiction wouldn't be understood until decades later. Researchers lacked the tools and frameworks to understand cocaine's effects on the brain. Television and popular culture of the 1950s and early 1960s rarely mentioned cocaine. The dominant cultural narratives emphasized conformity, respectability, and family values. Drug use, when depicted at all, was associated with criminal underworlds and social deviants, figures outside polite society. The occasional movie or TV show might feature a drug dealer or addict, but these were not glamorized. The contrast with how cocaine would be portrayed in the 1980s could not be more stark. But the seeds of change were being planted. In Colombia, a country that would become synonymous with cocaine, small-scale coca cultivation and paste production were beginning. Colombian criminal networks, initially focused on marijuana smuggling and general contraband, were learning the skills that would later be applied to cocaine. How to corrupt officials, how to move product across borders, how to launder money, how to use violence strategically. These were still small operations, barely visible on the international stage, but they would grow. The 1960s brought cultural upheaval that would eventually transform cocaine's place in American society. The counterculture, with its embrace of consciousness-altering substances, initially focused on marijuana and LSD. But as the decade progressed, cocaine made a comeback among the wealthy and famous. Cocaine's image began to shift from the degraded dope fiend of early 20th century propaganda to something more glamorous. Rock stars and movie actors reportedly used it, though usually discreetly. Unlike marijuana and LSD, which were associated with hippies and rebellion, cocaine suggested wealth and sophistication, a throwback to its early 20th century image. By the late 1960s, cocaine availability was increasing. Production in South America was ramping up, and smuggling routes were being established. But the explosion was still to come. Cocaine was expensive and relatively rare in the 1960s, a luxury drug for those with money and connections. It hadn't yet become a mass-market commodity, hadn't yet entered working-class neighborhoods, hadn't yet triggered the moral panic and enforcement crackdown that would define the 1980s. These quiet decades are important because they demonstrate a crucial point. Prohibition didn't eliminate cocaine. It just suppressed it temporarily under specific economic and social conditions. Once those conditions changed, once prosperity returned, once cultural attitudes toward drug use shifted, once smuggling networks developed, cocaine came roaring back. The prohibition infrastructure that had been built in the 1910s and 1920s hadn't solved the problem. It had just pushed it underground, where it mutated and adapted, waiting for conditions that would allow it to re-emerge stronger than ever. And those conditions were developing in South America, where coca cultivation was about to become an industry that would rival oil in profitability and exceed any legal crop in its impact on producing countries. The Colombian connection, rise of the cartels. The modern cocaine story is inextricable from Colombia, a nation that became synonymous with the drug. Despite having no traditional history of coca use, Colombia's role in the cocaine trade was not inevitable, but resulted from a specific combination of geographic, economic, political, and cultural factors that converged in the 1970s and exploded in the 1980s. Understanding how Colombia became the cocaine capital of the world requires understanding both the cultivation of coca and the criminal organizations that turned cultivation into a global industry worth billions of dollars. Coca, as we've noted, was traditionally cultivated in Peru and Bolivia, the heartland of ancient Andean civilizations. These countries had ideal growing conditions and thousands of years of cultural knowledge about coca. Colombia, by contrast, had limited coca cultivation before the 1970s. But Colombia had several advantages that would make it the center of cocaine production. A long Caribbean and Pacific coastline facilitating shipping, a weak central government with limited control over remote regions, a history of contraband smuggling through the Guajira Peninsula, a culture of entrepreneurship in both legal and illegal economies, and proximity to the crucial North American market. The transformation began with marijuana. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Colombian entrepreneurs in the coastal regions, particularly the Guajira Peninsula and the city of Santa Marta, developed sophisticated marijuana smuggling operations. They grew high-quality marijuana that American consumers preferred, established trafficking routes via boat and plane, created money laundering systems, and learned how to corrupt officials and use violence selectively to protect operations. These organizations included figures like Alberto Bravo and Griselda Blanco, pioneers who would transition from marijuana to cocaine as demand shifted. Cocaine's advantage over marijuana was simple mathematics. A kilogram of marijuana might sell for a few $100s. A kilogram of cocaine could sell for $60,000 or more in the United States by the late 1970s. Cocaine was more compact, easier to conceal, less detectable by smell, and far more valuable per unit of weight. The profit margins were extraordinary, approaching 2,000% from Colombian production to US street sales. For criminal organizations seeking maximum profit, the choice was obvious. The first major Colombian cocaine entrepreneur was Fabio Restrepo in the Medellin area. He established a processing operation that imported coca paste from Peru and Bolivia, refined it into cocaine hydrochloride, and shipped it to the United States. But in 1975, Restrepo was murdered, possibly over a business dispute. His operation was taken over by one of his employees, a young man from a poor Medellin neighborhood who had worked as a car thief, bodyguard, and smuggler. His name was Pablo Escobar Gaviria, and he would become the most famous drug trafficker in history. Pablo Escobar deserves attention not because he was unique, but because he exemplified the Medellin cartel's approach and because his story illuminates the broader dynamics of the cocaine trade. Born in 1949 to a middle-class family that fell into poverty, Escobar grew up in Medellin during a period of rapid urbanization and social disruption. He was intelligent, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. By his early 20s, he was involved in car theft and smuggling. When he entered the cocaine business, he brought an organizational genius that transformed a cottage industry into an industrial empire. Escobar's innovation was vertical integration and industrialization. Rather than simply buying cocaine from independent producers and reselling it, he controlled every stage of production and distribution. He imported coca paste in bulk from Peru and Bolivia, establishing relationships with coca growers and paste producers. He built large-scale cocaine processing laboratories in remote areas of Colombia, particularly in the Magdalena Medio region, where hundreds of workers refined paste into cocaine hydrochloride using industrial quantities of chemicals. He established transportation networks using planes, boats, and submarines to move product to the United States. He corrupted officials at every level, from local police to judges to politicians, and he used violence systematically to eliminate competition and intimidate anyone who opposed him. The Medellin cartel was never a formal organization with a corporate structure. It was a loose confederation of independent traffickers who cooperated on major shipments and shared resources. Besides Escobar, the key figures included the Ochoa family, Jorge, Juan David, and Fabio Ochoa, wealthy horse breeders who brought social connections and sophistication. Carlos Leda, a Colombian German who established a transshipment base in the Bahamas, revolutionized transportation by using small planes to move tons of cocaine through Caribbean islands. José Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, known as the Mexican for his admiration of Mexican drug traffickers, brought extreme violence and paramilitary tactics to the organization. The amounts of money involved were staggering beyond comprehension. At its peak in the late 1980s, the Medellin cartel was estimated to be supplying 80% of the cocaine entering the United States, shipping 15 tons per month. This generated revenues estimated at $420 million per week, over $20 billion per year. Escobar's personal fortune was estimated at $30 billion, making him one of the wealthiest people on earth. He couldn't spend or launder money fast enough. Stories circulated of money buried in fields and left to rot, of cash eaten by rats causing losses of $2 billion per year, of stacks of currency too large to count being weighed instead. Escobar used this wealth strategically. He built housing for the poor in Medellin, constructing entire neighborhoods and endearing himself to the city's underclass. He built soccer fields and sponsored youth teams. He portrayed himself as a Robin Hood figure, stealing from rich Americans and giving to poor Colombians. This strategy of social cleansing, combined with public works, made him genuinely popular among segments of Medellin's population, who saw him as a benefactor rather than a criminal. When he briefly served in Colombia's Congress in 1982, he walked the halls of power with impunity, a drug trafficker turned politician. But violence was the cartel's primary tool. The phrase plata o plomo, silver or lead, meaning take a bribe or take a bullet, became their motto. They murdered police officers by the hundreds. They assassinated judges who wouldn't be bought. They bombed a newspaper that criticized them. They placed a bomb on Avianca Flight 203 in 1989, killing 110 people in an unsuccessful attempt to kill a presidential candidate. They kidnapped and murdered politicians, journalists, and anyone else who threatened their operations. The violence peaked in 1991 when Pablo Escobar declared war on the Colombian state, initiating a bombing campaign in major cities that killed hundreds of civilians. The Colombian government's response was complicated by institutional weakness and corruption. Colombia in the 1970s and 1980s was a democracy, but a fragile one. Large areas of the country were outside government control, dominated by leftist guerrilla groups like the FARC and ELN, or by right-wing paramilitary organizations. The judicial system was understaffed and underfunded. Police and military were poorly paid, making them vulnerable to bribery. Politicians depended on patronage networks that were easily infiltrated by drug money. The traffickers didn't need to overthrow the government. They could simply buy enough of it to operate freely. The United States complicated matters further. American demand for cocaine was the fundamental driver of the entire trade. Every kilogram of cocaine produced in Colombia was destined for American users. The billions of dollars flowing to cartels came from Americans buying cocaine on street corners, in nightclubs, in suburban homes. Yet US policy focused almost exclusively on supply-side interventions in source countries, rather than addressing domestic demand. American officials pressured Colombia to arrest and extradite traffickers, threatening to decertify Colombia as a drug-fighting partner and cut off aid. This pressure often backfired, making the Colombian government appear to be an American puppet and giving traffickers nationalist credibility. The Cali cartel emerged as Medellin's rival in the 1980s. Based in the city of Cali in southwestern Colombia, this organization was led by the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, Gilberto and Miguel, along with José Santa Cruz Londoño and Helmer Herrera. The Cali cartel's approach differed from Medellin's in crucial ways. They preferred bribery over violence, though they were certainly capable of brutality when necessary. They operated more like a multinational corporation, with professional management, diversified investments, and a lower profile. They were known as the Gentlemen of Cali, contrasting themselves with Medellin's flamboyant violence. The rivalry between Medellin and Cali became a full-scale war by the late 1980s. Each cartel targeted the other's operations, personnel, and families. The violence spilled over into cities across Colombia. The Cali cartel even cooperated with Colombian authorities and American intelligence agencies to hunt down Escobar, providing information that led to the deaths or captures of many Medellin cartel members. This cooperation illustrated the pragmatic amorality of the drug war. The Colombian government worked with one group of cocaine traffickers to destroy another. The coca cultivation side of the equation was evolving simultaneously. Peru and Bolivia remained the primary coca growing regions, with hundreds of thousands of peasant farmers cultivating small plots. The coca was harvested, dried, and processed into coca paste in crude laboratories in the jungle. This paste was then transported to Colombia for final processing into cocaine hydrochloride. But by the late 1980s, Colombia was beginning to cultivate its own coca. particularly in regions controlled by guerrilla groups who taxed coca production to fund their operations. This vertical integration made Colombian organizations less dependent on Peruvian and Bolivian suppliers. The environmental impact was catastrophic. Coca cultivation required clearing rainforest. Processing labs dumped thousands of tons of toxic chemicals, sulfuric acid, kerosene, cement, acetone, directly into rivers and streams. In Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, vast areas of Amazon rainforest were destroyed to cultivate coca or build processing facilities. The biodiversity loss was incalculable. Remote indigenous communities found their rivers poisoned, their forests destroyed, their traditional ways of life disrupted by the influx of armed groups and the money from coca. The social impact on Colombia was equally devastating. The drug trade corrupted every institution. Police officers who refused bribes were murdered, along with their families. Judges were given the choice of accepting bribes or being assassinated. Hundreds chose exile instead. Journalists were killed for reporting on the cartels. Politicians were either bought or intimidated into silence. The state's monopoly on violence, the foundation of any functioning government, was challenged by traffickers who commanded private armies numbering in the thousands. Young men in Medellin and other cities were recruited into the cartels as assassins, often teenagers who killed for modest payments and the thrill of power. These sicarios, as they were called, became a generation defined by violence. They drove motorcycles through city streets, pulling alongside victims and shooting them in broad daylight. They murdered with such frequency that the violence became normalized. Medellin's homicide rate in the early 1990s reached 380 per 100,000 people, making it the most dangerous city on earth. The hunt for Pablo Escobar intensified after his 1991 to 1992 imprisonment in a luxurious self-built prison called La Catedral, from which he continued running his empire until the government attempted to transfer him to a real prison. He escaped and went into hiding. A special police unit called the Search Block, trained and equipped by the United States, hunted him with assistance from the DEA and CIA. A vigilante group called Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, likely connected to the Cali cartel and possibly to elements of Colombian security forces, targeted Escobar's family, associates, and properties. On December 2, 1993, Escobar was tracked to a middle-class neighborhood in Medellin. In a shootout on a rooftop, he was killed by Colombian police. He was 44 years old. His death marked the end of the Medellin cartel's dominance, but not the end of the cocaine trade. The Cali cartel expanded to fill the vacuum, and when the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers were arrested in the mid-1990s, newer organizations emerged. The Norte del Valle cartel, various paramilitary groups that used drug trafficking to fund their operations, and eventually smaller, more decentralized networks that proved harder to target than the large cartels. The Colombian cocaine trade transformed the country in ways that persist today. It funded decades of armed conflict, with leftist guerrillas, right-wing paramilitaries, and the cartels themselves all profiting from cocaine. It corrupted institutions that are still being rebuilt. It created a culture of violence that normalized murder as a problem-solving method. It distorted the economy, flooding certain regions with money while leaving others impoverished. And it made Colombia internationally synonymous with cocaine, overshadowing the country's rich culture, stunning natural beauty, and resilient democracy. Yet Colombians resisted. Judges, journalists, politicians, and ordinary citizens stood up to the traffickers at tremendous personal risk. Thousands were murdered for opposing the cartels. The Colombian people, despite everything, maintained democratic institutions, fought back against violence, and slowly, painfully, began to reclaim their country. The story of cocaine in Colombia is not just a story of criminals and corruption, but also one of courage and resistance against overwhelming odds. By the time Escobar died, cocaine had already wrought havoc far beyond Colombia. The product flowing from Colombian labs had reached American cities, and there it would trigger an epidemic that devastated communities, filled prisons, and reshaped American society in ways still felt today. The rise of crack cocaine in the 1980s marked a new chapter in cocaine's history, one defined by addiction on an industrial scale, racialized enforcement, and the policy disaster known as the War on Drugs. The 1980s epidemic, crack and urban devastation. 1980s witnessed cocaine's transformation from an expensive luxury drug associated with wealth and glamour to a devastating epidemic that ravaged America's inner cities. This transformation happened through a chemical modification so simple it could be performed in any kitchen, yet its consequences would reshape American society, criminal justice, and politics for decades. The story of crack cocaine is a story of how chemistry, economics, policy, and racial inequality combined to create one of the worst drug crises in American history. Crack cocaine is chemically similar to powder cocaine, but prepared for smoking rather than snorting or injecting. The process, known colloquially as freebase, involves dissolving cocaine hydrochloride in water, adding baking soda, and heating the mixture. The resulting solid, once dried and broken into small rocks or crack, can be smoked. When heated, crack vaporizes at a lower temperature than powder cocaine, and the vapors are absorbed through the lungs almost instantly, reaching the brain within seconds. The effects are dramatic. Smoking crack produces an intense euphoria, far more powerful than snorting powder cocaine. Users describe a rush of pleasure, confidence, and energy that is overwhelming in its intensity. But this intense high lasts only 5 to 10 minutes, followed by an equally intense crash characterized by depression, anxiety, and an immediate, desperate craving for more. This pharmacological profile, brief, intense high followed by severe crash and immediate craving, makes crack extraordinarily addictive. Users often binge, smoking repeatedly over hours or days until they run out of money, drugs, or physical capacity. Crack appeared in American cities around 1984 and 1985, though its exact origins are disputed. Some accounts suggest it emerged in Los Angeles, others in New York or Miami. What's certain is that it spread with frightening speed. By 1986, crack was available in virtually every major American city. The reasons for its rapid spread were economic and practical. Crack was cheap. A rock could sell for $5 to $10, compared to $100 for a gram of powder cocaine. This low price point made cocaine accessible to poor communities that couldn't afford powder. Crack was also easier to sell and distribute in small quantities, requiring less capital and sophistication than powder cocaine trafficking. The social dynamics of crack differed markedly from powder cocaine. Powder cocaine in the early 1980s was still associated with wealth, success, and disco-era glamour. It was a Wall Street drug, a Hollywood drug, snorted in penthouse bathrooms and exclusive clubs. Crack, by contrast, was immediately associated with urban poverty, particularly African American communities. This association was partly based in reality. Crack did disproportionately impact black neighborhoods, but was enormously amplified by media coverage and political rhetoric that racialized the crack epidemic in ways that powder cocaine never was. The impact on affected communities was catastrophic. Crack houses, abandoned buildings where users would gather to smoke, appeared across inner cities. These were often scenes of degradation and danger, with users trading sex for drugs, committing crimes to obtain money, and descending into severe addiction. Families were destroyed as parents abandoned children to pursue crack. Child welfare systems were overwhelmed with children taken from crack-addicted parents. Hospitals saw increases in babies born with prenatal crack exposure, creating a moral panic about crack babies that later research showed was significantly exaggerated. Violence exploded as competing dealers fought for territorial control of the crack market. The low price of crack meant dealers needed high volume to profit, creating intense competition. Unlike the cocaine distributors above them who operated relatively discreetly, street-level crack dealers were visible and vulnerable. Disputes were often resolved with guns. Young men in inner cities found that selling crack offered income impossible to achieve through legitimate employment, particularly in communities where deindustrialization had eliminated stable working-class jobs. The drug trade became an informal economy, employing thousands, with its own hierarchies, rules, and enforcement mechanisms. The homicide rate in American cities soared. In Washington, D.C., murders increased from 148 in 1985 to 483 in 1991. In New York, the crack era saw homicides peak at over 2,200 per year. Most victims were young Black and Latino men, killed in drug disputes or caught in crossfire. Emergency rooms were overwhelmed with gunshot victims. Entire neighborhoods became war zones, with children sleeping in bathtubs to avoid stray bullets, elderly residents afraid to leave their homes, and a pervasive sense that society was collapsing. The media response was frenzied and often irresponsible. Network news programs produced sensationalized stories about crack, with lurid imagery of addicts and crack houses. Newsweek and Time ran cover stories proclaiming crack the biggest story since Vietnam Watergate. The term crack epidemic entered common usage. Celebrity deaths, particularly those of basketball player Len Bias in 1986 and football player Don Rogers days later, though likely caused by powder cocaine rather than crack, fueled panic. Media coverage portrayed crack as uniquely dangerous, instantly addictive, and associated with black criminality in ways that reinforced racist stereotypes. Politicians responded with harsh criminal justice measures. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which created mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. The law included a provision that would become one of the most controversial aspects of American drug policy: the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Under this law, possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine triggered a mandatory 5-year federal prison sentence, while it took 500 grams of powder cocaine to trigger the same sentence. Since crack was predominantly used and sold in black communities, while powder cocaine was more common in white communities, this disparity had a devastating and discriminatory impact. The political environment of the 1980s made harsh drug laws politically irresistible. President Ronald Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan championed the Just Say No campaign, which treated drug use as primarily a matter of individual moral choice rather than a complex social problem. Reagan massively increased funding for drug enforcement while cutting funding for treatment programs. The Democratic Party, anxious not to appear soft on crime, supported or even championed tough drug laws. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act passed the House 392-16, a bipartisan consensus that would have devastating consequences. The result was mass incarceration on a scale unprecedented in American history. The number of people incarcerated in federal and state prisons for drug offenses increased from 41,000 in 1980 to 489,000 in 2013. State prison admissions for drug offenses increased from 15,000 in 1980 to 198,000. In 1996, most of those incarcerated were Black and Latino men, despite evidence that drug use rates were similar across racial groups. The racial disparity was stark. Black Americans constituted about 13% of drug users, but 35% of arrests, 55% of convictions, and 74% of incarcerations for drug offenses. The impact on black communities was catastrophic and multi-generational. With so many young men incarcerated, families were disrupted, economic opportunities diminished, and political power eroded as felons lost voting rights. Communities that were already disadvantaged by segregation, discriminatory housing and employment policies, and underfunded schools faced an additional burden. The war on drugs became, in effect, a war on poor Black and Latino communities, removing thousands of young men and funneling them into a criminal justice system that made successful reintegration nearly impossible. Police tactics became increasingly aggressive. SWAT teams, originally created for rare high-risk situations, were deployed for routine drug raids. Stop and frisk policies allowed police to stop and search individuals based on minimal suspicion, disproportionately targeting young men of color. The militarization of policing, with police departments acquiring military equipment and adopting warrior mentalities, escalated confrontations between police and communities. Trust between police and the communities they served eroded, replaced by mutual suspicion and hostility. Public health approaches to crack addiction were inadequate. Treatment programs were underfunded and often inaccessible, with waiting lists stretching months. The model of treatment emphasized abstinence and often involved confrontational approaches that were poorly suited to crack addiction. Harm reduction strategies like needle exchange programs faced political opposition based on claims they enabled drug use. Methadone maintenance, successful for opioid addiction, had no equivalent for crack cocaine. Users who wanted help often couldn't get it, while the criminal justice system stood ready to incarcerate them. The crack epidemic also had gender dimensions that received less attention, but were equally significant. Women, particularly Black women, suffered tremendously. Crack addiction led many into prostitution to support their habits. Pregnant women who used crack faced prosecution for child endangerment or chemical abuse of a fetus. Policies that discouraged them from seeking prenatal care. The image of the crack whore, a deeply misogynistic stereotype, was used to justify punitive policies and moral condemnation while ignoring the trauma, poverty, and limited options that often led women to crack use. By the mid-1990s, the crack epidemic was waning. Crack hadn't disappeared, but usage rates were declining. Several factors contributed. The violence and visible destruction made crack less appealing to potential new users. Communities developed their own responses, with families, churches, and community organizations creating support systems. Some limited expansion of treatment access helped, and the generation most affected by crack was aging out of peak drug-using years. But the damage persisted in mass incarceration, in communities still struggling with the aftermath, in families still broken. The policy response to crack is now widely recognized as a failure that caused enormous unnecessary suffering. The 100-to-1 sentencing disparity was reduced to 18-to-1 by the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, an acknowledgement that the original disparity was unjustifiable. But thousands remain in prison serving sentences under the old law. The broader war on drugs continues despite overwhelming evidence of its failure to reduce drug availability or use, its massive cost, and its devastating impact on minority communities. The crack epidemic demonstrated truths that remain relevant. Addiction is not primarily a criminal justice problem, but a public health problem. Prohibition creates illegal markets that generate violence. Punitive policies disproportionately harm already marginalized communities. And media and political hysteria can produce policies that cause more harm than the problems they aim to solve. Yet these lessons have been imperfectly learned. As we trace cocaine's story through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, we see these same patterns repeating with variations as new drugs emerge and new panics develop. Global consequences, environmental and political devastation. The cocaine trade's impacts extend far beyond users in consumer countries or even violence in producer countries. The production, trafficking, and prohibition of cocaine have caused environmental catastrophe, political instability, human rights abuses, and economic distortion across Latin America. Understanding these global consequences is essential to grasping the full scope of cocaine's impact on our world. The environmental destruction begins with cultivation. Coca grows best on sloped terrain in tropical regions, often in or near rainforest. To plant coca, farmers must clear forest, destroying biodiversity hotspots that can never be fully restored. Estimates suggest that coca cultivation has caused the deforestation of over 7 million acres of rainforest in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia combined. This deforestation contributes to climate change, disrupts water cycles, causes soil erosion, and eliminates habitat for countless species, some likely going extinct before they're even catalogued by science. The processing of coca paste and cocaine hydrochloride creates additional environmental damage. For every kilogram of cocaine produced, between 200 and 600 liters of chemicals are used and disposed of, typically by dumping directly into rivers and streams. These chemicals include gasoline, kerosene, sulfuric acid, acetone, toluene, and carbide lime. In Colombia alone, an estimated 17 million liters of chemical waste enter watersheds annually from cocaine production. Fish populations are decimated, water becomes undrinkable. Communities downstream from processing areas suffer health problems from contaminated water. The clandestine nature of cocaine production means it occurs in remote areas with no environmental oversight. Laboratory sites are abandoned when enforcement pressure increases, leaving toxic waste behind. The semi-nomadic pattern of coca cultivation, driven by eradication efforts, creates a cycle of environmental destruction. Farmers clear new forest to replace eradicated fields, abandon old growing areas which don't reforest naturally, and move to ever more remote locations, pushing the frontier of destruction deeper into the wilderness. The political consequences in producing countries have been equally severe. In Colombia, cocaine funded decades of armed conflict between leftist guerrillas, right-wing paramilitaries, and the state. The FARC, Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, controlled coca-growing regions and taxed production, earning billions of dollars that funded weapons, recruitment, and operations. This drug money prolonged a conflict that killed hundreds of thousands of Colombians and displaced millions internally. Peace negotiations with the FARC, finally successful in 2016, were complicated by the question of how to address the cocaine economy that sustained the insurgency. Peru and Bolivia experienced similar dynamics. The Shining Path, a Maoist guerrilla group in Peru, controlled coca-growing regions of the upper Huallaga Valley in the 1980s and 1990s. They provided protection to coca farmers against government eradication efforts, funded themselves through revolutionary taxes on the drug trade, and created de facto states within the state where government authority didn't reach. Bolivia's political landscape has been shaped by coca growers' unions, which became a significant political force. Evo Morales, Bolivia's first indigenous president, rose to power partially through his leadership of coca growers, advocating for the right to cultivate coca for traditional purposes while opposing cocaine production. The corruption of state institutions is perhaps the most insidious political consequence. The enormous profits from cocaine provide resources to corrupt that no legitimate government salary can compete with. Police officers, judges, military personnel, customs officials, and politicians at all levels have been compromised. In some cases, entire institutions have been corrupted. Mexico, though not traditionally a coca-growing country, became a major cocaine trafficking corridor in the 1990s and 2000s, leading to violence that has killed tens of thousands and corrupted large portions of Mexican law, enforcement, and government. The phenomenon of narco-states, countries where drug traffickers exercise significant political power, emerged in the cocaine-producing regions. At various times, allegations have been made about cocaine money influencing presidential elections in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. The line between legitimate business, politics, and drug trafficking became blurred as traffickers sought to launder money through legal enterprises and sought political protection through campaign contributions or outright bribery. The human rights consequences have been profound. Forced displacement has affected millions. In Colombia, paramilitary groups funded by cocaine profits carried out massacres of civilians suspected of sympathizing with guerrillas. Guerrilla groups, also funded by cocaine, kidnapped thousands for ransom. Farmers caught between all sides faced impossible choices: cooperate with whoever controlled your area or flee. Indigenous communities in coca-growing regions saw their territories invaded by armed groups, their traditional lifestyles disrupted, and their cultures threatened. Labor conditions in the coca economy have been exploitative and dangerous. Coca pickers work long hours for minimal pay. Children are sometimes employed in harvesting. Workers in processing labs face exposure to toxic chemicals without protection. Forced labor has been documented in some coca-growing regions, with workers held in debt bondage or threatened with violence if they attempt to leave. The clandestine nature of the industry means no labor protections apply, and workers have no recourse against exploitation. The US policy of supply-side interdiction has caused additional problems. Aerial fumigation of coca fields in Colombia, carried out from 1994 to 2015, sprayed herbicides over vast areas. While officially targeting only coca, the spraying often affected legal crops, forests, and human communities. Health problems were reported in fumigated areas. The policy was ultimately suspended after the World Health Organization classified glyphosate, the herbicide used, as probably carcinogenic. Alternative development programs, meant to help farmers transition from coca to legal crops, have had mixed results, often failing because legal crops can't compete economically with coca. Military involvement in drug enforcement has militarized the problem, treating it as a security issue rather than a development or public health challenge. The US has provided billions in military aid to Colombia, Peru, and other countries, training and equipping military and police forces. This Plan Colombia approach achieved some successes in reducing coca cultivation and weakening guerrilla groups, but at enormous cost in human rights abuses, environmental damage, and continued violence. Critics argue it's a whack-a-mole approach that simply displaces cultivation from one region to another without addressing underlying causes. The economic impact on producing countries is paradoxical. The cocaine trade generates billions of dollars annually, some of which circulates in local economies. In remote rural areas with limited economic opportunities, coca provides income impossible to achieve through legal crops. But this money comes with strings: violence, corruption, instability. The narco economy distorts normal economic development, inflating prices, directing investment toward luxury goods and money laundering rather than productive enterprise, and creating boom-bust cycles tied to enforcement pressure and market fluctuations. The diaspora effects spread cocaine's impacts globally. Colombian cocaine reaches not just North America, but Europe, Asia, and Australia. Trafficking routes cross Africa, where violence and corruption follow. Mexican cartels expanded from transshipping Colombian cocaine to manufacturing methamphetamine and heroin, applying lessons learned in the cocaine trade. The Calabrian 'Ndrangheta in Italy became Europe's primary cocaine importer. Russian organized crime groups moved cocaine into Eastern Europe. The global reach of cocaine trafficking means that decisions made in consumer countries about drug policy affect people and environments thousands of miles away. International drug control efforts, coordinated through the United Nations, have struggled with fundamental contradictions. The international regime is based on prohibition, but this policy clearly hasn't stopped production or use. Bolivia's decision to allow coca cultivation for traditional use put it at odds with international treaty obligations, leading to its temporary withdrawal from the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. The tension between coca as a traditional, culturally important plant and cocaine as an internationally controlled substance remains unresolved. The question of alternative development, helping coca farmers transition to legal livelihoods, confronts harsh economic realities. Coffee, cacao, palm oil, and other legal crops can't compete with coca's profitability. especially given infrastructure challenges in remote regions. Transportation costs eat into margins for legal products that must reach distant markets, while cocaine's high value-to-weight ratio makes it profitable even with difficult transportation. Successful alternative development requires not just crop substitution, but building roads, providing market access, ensuring security, and creating entire economic ecosystems, investments that require sustained commitment and resources. Climate change adds another dimension to this complex picture. Changing rainfall patterns and temperatures are affecting coca-growing regions. Some research suggests coca might become viable in new areas, potentially spreading cultivation. Conversely, traditional growing regions might become less suitable, forcing cultivation into even more remote and environmentally sensitive areas. The intersection of climate change, cocaine cultivation, and deforestation creates feedback loops that accelerate environmental degradation. The global consequences of cocaine remind us that drug policy is never purely a domestic issue. Every line of cocaine snorted in a nightclub in New York or London connects to deforestation in the Amazon, violence in Colombian cities, corruption in Mexican government, and poverty in Bolivian coca-growing regions. The connections are direct and undeniable. Yet consumer countries have consistently failed to address their own demand, while expecting producer countries to solve the supply problem, an approach that shifts costs and consequences to the world's poorest regions, while allowing wealthy consumers to continue their habits with minimal interference. As we move into the contemporary era, these global consequences continue to unfold. New trafficking routes emerge, violence shifts from one country to another, environmental destruction spreads, and the fundamental questions remain unresolved. How do we address cocaine's harms without causing greater harms through prohibition? How do we respect indigenous rights to traditional coca use while controlling cocaine production? How do we reduce demand in consumer countries? How do we support affected communities in healing and recovery? The answers remain elusive, but the urgency of finding them only grows. The modern era, cocaine in the 21st century. As we enter the third decade of the 21st century, cocaine remains as available and widely used as ever, despite more than a century of prohibition and decades of the war on drugs. The modern cocaine trade has evolved, adapted and metastasized in ways that earlier generations couldn't have imagined. Understanding the contemporary situation requires examining how cocaine markets function today, who uses cocaine and why, how enforcement has changed, and what new approaches might offer hope for reducing harm. Global cocaine production has reached record levels. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that coca cultivation and cocaine manufacture hit all-time highs in recent years. Colombia, despite decades of eradication efforts and billions in US aid, produces more cocaine now than at any point in its history. Between 2014 and 2020, Colombian coca cultivation more than doubled. The reasons are complex. The FARC peace process removed control structures in some regions. Criminal groups moved into vacuums. Coca prices increased, making cultivation more attractive. And farmers continued to have limited alternatives for making a living. The trafficking networks have become more sophisticated and decentralized. The large cartels that dominated in the 1980s and 1990s have been replaced by smaller, more flexible organizations. These groups are harder to target because they lack the hierarchical structures that made the Medellin and Cali cartels vulnerable. Instead, the cocaine trade operates more like a global supply chain, with different organizations handling different stages: cultivation, processing, transshipment, wholesale distribution and retail sales. Cooperation between groups is often temporary and transaction-based, rather than involving permanent alliances. Mexican cartels have become the primary distributors of cocaine into the United States, having taken over from Colombian organizations. Groups like the Sinaloa cartel and cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación control sophisticated logistics operations, moving thousands of tons annually across the US-Mexico border. They've innovated constantly. Tunnels under the border, ultra-light aircraft, submarines, drones, and concealment methods of extraordinary creativity. Each enforcement success leads to adaptation rather than defeat. European cocaine markets have expanded dramatically. Europe is now the world's second-largest cocaine market after North America, with particularly high use in the United Kingdom, Spain, the Netherlands, and Belgium. European cocaine is predominantly shipped through West African countries or directly from South America to European ports. The port of Antwerp in Belgium has become a major entry point, with authorities seizing tens of tons annually while acknowledging far more gets through. European organized crime groups, particularly the 'Ndrangheta in Italy and Albanian groups, control much of the distribution. The user base has diversified and, in some ways, normalized. In the United States, past-year cocaine use has remained relatively stable at around 2% of adults, representing millions of users. The demographic profile is broad. Professionals using cocaine to enhance productivity, entertainment industry workers, college students, clubgoers, and chronic users struggling with addiction. The stigma has partially lifted in some social contexts, with cocaine use portrayed in popular culture as edgy or sophisticated rather than degraded. The internet and cryptocurrency have added new dimensions to cocaine trafficking. While most cocaine still moves through traditional physical channels, dark web marketplaces allow direct buyer-seller connections without territorial middlemen. Cryptocurrency enables untraceable payments. Encrypted messaging apps facilitate coordination. Technology hasn't replaced traditional trafficking, but has added layers of complexity that challenge enforcement. The purity and price of cocaine have fluctuated, but remain relatively stable compared to historical patterns. Street cocaine in the United States averages between 50 and 70% purity, with the remainder being cutting agents ranging from relatively benign substances like lactose to dangerous adulterants like levamisole, a veterinary deworming drug, or fentanyl. Prices vary by region, but typically range from $60 to $100 per gram at retail level, representing a significant markup from the $1,500 to $3,000 per kilogram wholesale price in Colombia. The health consequences of modern cocaine use remain severe. Emergency room visits involving cocaine number in the hundreds of thousands annually in the United States. Cocaine contributes to cardiovascular problems, including heart attacks and strokes, even in young users. The combination of cocaine and alcohol, extremely common, produces cocaethylene in the liver, a toxic metabolite that significantly increases cardiac risk. The adulteration of cocaine with fentanyl, while less common than with heroin, has caused fatal overdoses, as users accustomed to cocaine's effects are unprepared for a powerful opioid. Cocaine addiction treatment has advanced, but faces persistent challenges. Cognitive behavioral therapy has shown effectiveness in helping users modify behavior patterns and develop coping strategies. Contingency management, which provides rewards for clean drug tests, has demonstrated success in clinical trials. But there is still no medication equivalent to methadone for heroin addiction or buprenorphine for opioid dependence. Researchers have tested various medications, disulfiram, modafinil, topiramate, with modest results. The lack of a pharmacological intervention makes treatment more difficult, and relapse rates remain high. The criminal justice approach to cocaine has evolved slowly and unevenly. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 reduced the federal crack-to-powder sentencing disparity from 100:1 to 18:1, a significant improvement but still reflecting disparity. Some states have reformed their drug laws, reducing sentences, implementing drug courts that divert offenders to treatment, and experimenting with defelonization of simple possession. But many jurisdictions maintain harsh penalties, and federal law still treats cocaine trafficking as a serious crime requiring substantial prison time. The debate over drug policy has shifted significantly in the 21st century. Portugal's 2001 decriminalization of personal drug possession, which treats possession as an administrative violation rather than a crime and emphasizes treatment over punishment, has been cited as a successful model. Drug use rates in Portugal haven't increased dramatically, and problematic use has decreased. This has emboldened reform advocates to argue for decriminalization in other countries. Several US states have decriminalized marijuana, and Oregon decriminalized personal possession of all drugs in 2020, though implementation has been controversial and the law was repealed in 2024. The harm reduction movement has gained prominence, advocating for policies that reduce the negative consequences of drug use without requiring abstinence. Needle exchange programs, safe injection sites, drug checking services that identify adulterants, and naloxone distribution to reverse opioid overdoses all reflect harm reduction philosophy. While these programs have focused primarily on opioid use, some principles apply to cocaine, providing honest information about risks, ensuring users have access to medical care without fear of prosecution, and treating drug use as a health issue. Latin American leaders have increasingly questioned the drug war paradigm. Former presidents from Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil have called for drug policy reform, arguing that prohibition has failed and causes more harm than drug use itself. They point to the violence, corruption, and instability that the cocaine trade has caused in their countries, while consumption continues unabated in the United States and Europe. These calls for reform face opposition from current leaders who fear appearing soft on crime, and from the United States government, which has historically pressured Latin American countries to maintain prohibition. The tension between traditional coca use and cocaine prohibition remains unresolved. Bolivia under Evo Morales defended the right of indigenous people to cultivate and use coca as part of their cultural heritage. The Bolivian constitution recognizes coca as cultural patrimony and allows cultivation for traditional use. But distinguishing between coca for traditional use and coca destined for cocaine production is difficult in practice. International drug control treaties struggle with this distinction, generally viewing all coca cultivation with suspicion despite its cultural importance. Environmental approaches to coca cultivation are being explored. Some programs attempt to work with rather than against farmers, providing support for sustainable coca cultivation within limits, combined with alternative development for those willing to transition to other crops. The theory is that respecting traditional use while providing economic alternatives will be more successful than forced eradication. Results have been mixed, and the programs face opposition from prohibitionists who reject any tolerance of coca cultivation. Technology is being deployed on both sides of the cocaine trade. Law enforcement uses satellites to detect coca fields, algorithms to analyze financial transactions for money laundering, and sophisticated surveillance to track suspects. Traffickers use encrypted communications, drones, submarines, and increasingly sophisticated concealment methods. It's an arms race where each side's innovations drive the other's adaptations, and the overall effect on cocaine availability is minimal. The COVID-19 pandemic affected cocaine markets in interesting ways. Initial lockdowns disrupted trafficking routes and decreased demand as nightclubs and social venues closed. Prices increased and availability decreased in some markets, but traffickers adapted quickly, and by late 2020, cocaine markets had largely recovered. The pandemic demonstrated both the resilience of drug markets and their fundamental economic nature. Where demand exists, supply will find a way to meet it regardless of obstacles. The opioid epidemic has overshadowed cocaine in US policy attention over the past decade. Fentanyl and prescription opioid overdoses have killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, drawing resources and attention to opioid-related issues. Cocaine deaths have increased, but remain a smaller portion of drug overdose fatalities. This has created a situation where cocaine, despite being widely used and causing significant harm, receives less policy focus than opioids. The danger is that lessons from the failed war on drugs will be forgotten and repeated with opioids. Cocaine's cultural presence has evolved in complex ways. In popular music, particularly hip-hop and electronic dance music, cocaine references remain common, though often coded. Television shows like Narcos have portrayed cocaine trafficking with a mix of critique and inadvertent glamorization. The cultural meaning of cocaine varies by context, sometimes associated with excess and self-destruction, sometimes with success and confidence, sometimes with addiction and tragedy. This cultural ambiguity reflects cocaine's complex reality. It is dangerous and pleasurable, destructive and seductive, all at once. The question of legalization has entered mainstream debate. Though cocaine legalization remains more controversial than marijuana, advocates argue that regulated legal markets would eliminate the violence, corruption, and adulteration associated with prohibition, while generating tax revenue and allowing public health approaches to problematic use. Opponents argue that legalization would increase use, particularly among youth, and that cocaine's addictive potential makes legal markets irresponsible. The debate often generates more heat than light, with both sides sometimes overstating their cases. Research into cocaine's neurological effects has advanced significantly with modern brain imaging and molecular biology. We now understand that cocaine blocks dopamine reuptake, causing dopamine to accumulate in synapses and creating the intense pleasure associated with cocaine use. Chronic use leads to changes in brain reward systems, reducing sensitivity to natural rewards and increasing sensitivity to drug cues. This neurobiological understanding helps explain why addiction is so difficult to overcome and why treatment must address both brain, chemistry, and behavioral patterns. The pharmaceutical interest in cocaine has not entirely disappeared. While medical use is now limited to topical anesthesia in specific procedures, researchers continue to study cocaine's mechanisms to develop better treatments for addiction, or to create medications with cocaine's beneficial properties without its addictive potential. Some ADHD medications work through similar dopamine mechanisms, though with much slower onset and less abuse potential. The dream of separating cocaine's benefits from its harms continues to motivate research. International cooperation on cocaine control has increased in some ways, while remaining politically fraught in others. Information sharing between law enforcement agencies has improved. Joint operations target major trafficking organizations. Financial intelligence sharing helps track money laundering, but fundamental disagreements about approach persist. Should the focus be on supply reduction in producing countries or demand reduction in consuming countries? Should treatment be emphasized over incarceration? Should traditional coca use be protected or eliminated? These questions divide nations and complicate cooperative efforts. The economics of cocaine continue to drive the trade. A kilogram of cocaine that costs perhaps $1,500 to $3,000 to produce in Colombia might sell for $30,000 to $40,000 in wholesale markets in the United States or Europe. The profit margins are so enormous that they overwhelm most enforcement efforts. Seizures that would cripple legal businesses are mere cost of doing business for cocaine traffickers who factor in loss rates. Unless these economic fundamentals change, either through dramatically reduced demand or legalization that eliminates the prohibition, premium cocaine trafficking will remain enormously profitable and therefore persistent. The modern cocaine situation is one of stalemate. Despite massive enforcement efforts, spending that runs into hundreds of billions of dollars over decades, and countless lives lost to violence and overdose, cocaine remains widely available at stable prices. Use rates fluctuate, but don't show any clear trend toward elimination. The war on drugs, at least regarding cocaine, has clearly failed to achieve its stated objective of a drug-free society. Yet the political and institutional momentum behind prohibition remains strong, making fundamental policy change difficult, despite growing recognition that current approaches aren't working. As we approach the conclusion of this long journey through cocaine's history, we're left with difficult questions and few easy answers. How do we respect the traditional uses of coca while addressing cocaine's harms? How do we reduce demand in ways that actually work, rather than simply making us feel like we're doing something? How do we shift from punitive approaches that have demonstrably failed to public health approaches that might succeed? How do we address the inequities of enforcement that have devastated minority communities? And perhaps most fundamentally, how do we have honest conversations about drugs in a political environment that often privileges ideology over evidence? Reflection and closing. Lessons from 5 millennia. We have traveled from the high Andes, where ancestors discovered that chewing coca leaves made altitude bearable, through Inca civilization, where coca was sacred, through Spanish colonialism, where it became a tool of exploitation, through 19th century laboratories where cocaine was isolated, through the Golden Age when it was celebrated as a wonder drug, through the era of prohibition and criminalization, through the rise of Colombian cartels and the devastation of the crack epidemic, through decades of failed drug war, to our present moment where cocaine remains as available as ever, despite everything. What have we learned from this long, complex, often tragic history? Perhaps the first lesson is that prohibition, despite a century of effort and unfathomable cost, has failed to eliminate cocaine or even significantly reduce its availability. The policy has succeeded in creating enormous collateral damage, mass incarceration, violence in producing countries, environmental destruction, corrupted institutions, but has not achieved its primary objective. This suggests that prohibition may be an inherently flawed approach to controlling substances for which demand exists, particularly substances that can be produced relatively easily and inexpensively from agricultural products. The second lesson is that the harms we associate with cocaine are not solely or even primarily caused by the drug itself, but by the conditions under which it is produced, distributed, and consumed under prohibition. The violence of the cocaine trade is not caused by cocaine, but by competition for market share in illegal markets, where disputes cannot be resolved through legal means. The adulteration of cocaine with dangerous substances happens because illegal markets have no quality control or consumer protection. The mass incarceration of cocaine users is obviously a policy choice, not an inevitable consequence of the drug's existence. Many of cocaine's worst harms are iatrogenic, caused by our attempts to solve the problem. The third lesson is that drug policy is inseparable from broader issues of race, class, and social justice. From the racial panics about black cocaine users in the early 20th century South, through the crack sentencing disparities that imprisoned a generation of black Americans, to the selective enforcement that continues today, cocaine policy has been a tool of racial control and oppression. Any serious reform must grapple with this history and its continuing legacy. Drug policy that doesn't address racial justice is incomplete and likely to perpetuate existing inequities. The fourth lesson is that traditional plant use and purified alkaloid use are fundamentally different and should be treated differently. Coca leaf, as used for thousands of years in the Andes, causes minimal harm and provides genuine benefits. Cocaine hydrochloride, particularly when smoked or injected in high doses, is highly addictive and dangerous. The prohibition regime's inability or unwillingness to distinguish between these uses has caused unnecessary conflict and suffering. Respecting indigenous rights to traditional coca use while controlling cocaine. Trafficking is complex but necessary. The fifth lesson is that treating addiction as primarily a criminal justice problem rather than a public health problem has been catastrophic. Incarcerating addicts doesn't cure addiction. It just interrupts it temporarily while making successful recovery more difficult upon release. Treatment, particularly treatment that is voluntary, accessible, and evidence-based, offers hope for people struggling with cocaine use disorder, but treatment has been consistently underfunded, while enforcement has received massive resources. This imbalance reflects political choices, not evidence about what works. The sixth lesson is that consumer countries have moral responsibility for the consequences of their drug consumption in producer countries. American and European cocaine users are not just making personal choices about their own health. They are participating in an economic system that funds violence, corruption, and environmental destruction thousands of miles away. Yet consumer country policies have consistently focused on punishing supply while doing little to reduce demand. This outsourcing of consequences to the world's poorest regions, while the wealthy consume with relative impunity, is a form of imperialism. The seventh lesson is that harm reduction, meeting people where they are, providing services that reduce negative consequences without requiring abstinence, offers a more humane and often more effective approach than punishment and forced abstinence. Drug checking services, safe injection sites, honest drug education, and access to medical care without fear of legal consequences all reduce harm. These approaches recognize that drug use exists and will continue to exist, and that reducing suffering is more important than moral condemnation. The eighth lesson is that honest, evidence-based drug education is more effective than fear-based propaganda. DARE programs and Just Say No campaigns that exaggerated dangers and used scare tactics largely failed because young people recognized the dishonesty and discounted all anti-drug messages, even accurate ones. Providing honest information about risks, acknowledging that drugs can be pleasurable while also dangerous, and teaching actual harm reduction strategies would better prepare people to make informed decisions. The ninth lesson is that policy change is possible even after decades of failed approaches. The reduction of the crack powder sentencing disparity, state-level marijuana legalization, drug court diversion programs, and growing acceptance of harm reduction all represent shifts away from pure prohibition and punishment. These changes have happened because evidence accumulated, because affected communities organized and advocated, because the human and financial costs became impossible to ignore. Further reform is possible if we're willing to follow evidence over ideology. The 10th and perhaps most important lesson is that there are no simple solutions. Cocaine is neither simply good nor simply bad. People use it for complex reasons, to cope with trauma, to enhance experience, to self-medicate mental health conditions, to conform to peer pressure, to rebel out of curiosity, or because addiction has eliminated choice. Addressing cocaine's harms requires addressing these underlying reasons, which means addressing poverty, trauma, mental health, social isolation, lack of opportunity, and many other factors that make drug use appealing or that make quitting difficult. This is hard, expensive, long-term work that lacks the political appeal of tough-on-crime rhetoric, but it's the work that might actually succeed. As we conclude this long meditation on cocaine's history, it's worth returning to where we began, the coca leaf in the Andes. That plant, growing in thin mountain air, is not inherently evil. It's a botanical product that humans discovered could ease their suffering and enhance their capacities. The fact that we learned to concentrate its active principle, that we created social and economic systems around its production and distribution, that we made policy choices about how to respond to its use. These are human choices, not inevitable outcomes. The story of cocaine is a mirror reflecting ourselves, our ingenuity in isolating and purifying plant compounds, our business acumen in creating markets, our medical brilliance in developing anesthesia, our capacity for addiction, our tendency toward moral panic, our racial prejudices, our punitiveness toward those who transgress social norms, our difficulty in admitting when policies aren't working, our resilience in facing addiction, our courage in standing up to violence and corruption. All of it is there in cocaine's history. We live with the consequences of decisions made over the past century about how to respond to cocaine. The mass incarceration, the violence in producing countries, the continued use despite prohibition, the racial disparities in enforcement, these are our inheritance. But we are not bound to continue these policies simply because they have existed for so long. Every generation has the opportunity to look honestly at evidence, to acknowledge what isn't working, to try new approaches, to prioritize reducing harm over expressing moral disapproval. Cocaine will not disappear from human society anytime soon. Even if every coca plant were eliminated tomorrow, an impossibility given the plant's wide distribution and the many countries where it grows, synthetic cocaine could be produced in laboratories. The demand for cocaine's effects, the allure of its profits, and the networks that distribute it have proven extraordinarily resilient. But cocaine's harms could be dramatically reduced through wiser policies, treating addiction as a health issue, ending mass incarceration for drug offenses, supporting alternative development in producing countries, implementing harm reduction programs, addressing the racial inequities in enforcement, respecting indigenous rights to traditional coca use, and honestly evaluating our approaches based on outcomes rather than ideology. The night has grown deep as we've traveled through these 5,000 years. We've seen empires rise and fall, seen a sacred leaf become a profitable crop, seen a miracle medicine become a social scourge, seen lives destroyed and fortunes built, seen policies fail again and again while we continue them regardless. The story of cocaine is not over. It continues to unfold in the mountains of Colombia where coca grows, in the neighborhoods where crack is sold, in the nightclubs where cocaine is casually consumed, in the prisons filled with drug offenders, in the laboratories where researchers seek treatments for addiction, in the policy debates about reform. If this long exploration has shown you anything, perhaps it's that simple answers don't exist for complex problems. Cocaine is not a problem that can be solved by willpower alone, by law enforcement alone, by treatment alone, or by any single approach. It requires understanding the full scope of the issue, from cultivation to consumption, from policy to pharmacology, from individual choices to systemic factors. It requires humility about the limits of our knowledge and the failures of our past approaches. And it requires compassion for everyone affected. The users struggling with addiction, the families torn apart by the drug war, the communities in producing countries devastated by violence, the police officers risking their lives, the farmers with limited options, all of us navigating this complex and often tragic reality. If you found value in this journey through history's shadow, if these hours in the darkness have illuminated something about our world and ourselves, consider subscribing to continue exploring the paths we've taken and the roads we might yet travel. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what history would you like to unravel next? Until we meet again in the quiet hours, may your rest be peaceful, and may we collectively find the wisdom to address these challenges with more compassion and honesty than generations past. The mountain wind still blows across the Andes, the coca plant still grows, and humanity continues its complex, contradictory relationship with substances that alter consciousness, seeking pleasure and relief while struggling with the consequences, trying to control what may be beyond control, hoping for solutions while often repeating the mistakes of the past. The story continues, and how it ends depends on the choices we make today.